Today we're going to be building our own property selling marketplace just like Zillow without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Before I say another word though, let's dive in and take a quick look at what we're going to be building. Over in a preview of my application, I've currently opened up my Zillow clone homepage, and as you'll see, we have a long list of featured properties. Now this list will include properties that are both for sale as well as properties that are rentals. And look, it goes without saying that this page alongside our full application is going to be completely responsive today. So regardless of our user's browser size or even the device they're viewing this on, they're going to have a beautiful end user experience. And that's even going to include the small things like our navigation menu. If we close this off, you'll see that we now have this droppable menu here. And look, it's just the small details like that that are really going to take our application to the next level. If I expand my page back out though, what I'm going to do is now perform a search for a specific region in which I want to discover properties. So I'm just going to type in San Francisco. I'll select on this. It's going to run a workflow and it's going to send us through to a search results page where we're going to now see a list of all of the properties based in this region. And of course, we're not only going to see a list of all of these properties formatted as nice cards, but we'll also be able to interact and see where these properties are within our map. Now, if I really wanted, I could also choose to filter these properties down. So let's say I want to search for all of the properties that are for sale and where the minimum price is above $1.5 million, because hey, your boy's a big spender over here. And look, if you really wanted, you could further refine this search by the bedroom count, the bathroom count, or even what type of property it is. But look, my eye's been caught out to this property here. So I'm going to select on this. It's going to open up a pop-up and it's going to display not only the full details of this property, but it'll also display all of the property features, a full list of all of this property's images, as well as the extended property summary. I can also choose to bookmark this property. So if I select this little heart icon, it's going to save that to my list of favorites. And if I really wanted, I could choose to contact the agent who has listed this property, from which I could just add in all of my details and a message that I would like to send them. Now over in the back end of my application, if I'm logged in as a real estate agent or a property manager, I can view a list of all of my current property listings, or even those properties that are now off market. So these are the properties that have already sold or I potentially leased them out. Now, if I was to select through and view the details of a specific property, so in this case, I'd like to view all of the information for this property I've listed. I'm going to click this button here, and it's now going to send me through to a dedicated dashboard where I can see how many views this property's received, how many saves it has, as well as a list of all of the contact form submissions from potential buyers of this property. And so when I view this here, it's going to open up this pop-up and display all of the information for that contact form. Finally, if I just jump back to this page where I can manage my property listings, you'll see that I also have this option to create a new listing here. And on this page, I'll just be required to add in some information about this. So things like what type of listing this is, the address. If I click next, it'll then require me to add in all of the details for things like the bedroom count, the bathroom count, as well as all of the images I'd like to add. And when I publish that, it will then become visible in our marketplace. Now look, this is just a handful of the features that are going to power our Zillow clone today. There's still so much happening behind the scenes that I can't wait to show you in more detail. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, I'm sure you know firsthand just how complicated it can be to bring your vision to life. And look, by complicated, I just mean time-consuming, expensive, and confusing as hell. Well, if you're a non-technical person just like this guy, Bubble's gonna be your new best friend when it comes to creating your own custom application. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that you can create fully functional features by visually stitching your application together. It's kind of just like creating an app using Lego blocks instead of having to actually code. Now, when it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite. Not only does it allow you to create your own custom database, but you can design the interface of your application, you can stitch everything together using visual workflows, and you can also integrate with third-party tools and services. Now, each one of these would be a standalone no-code tool. So it truly just blows my mind that all of that is included in one single platform. Now, of course, the other benefit to that is that you don't have to spend as long learning a whole bunch of different tools, and it's just going to save you money. You only have to pay for one tool instead of 4 different ones. Now look, by this point, I've already said enough, so why don't we just grab our Bubble editor and I can start walking you through the process. When it comes to our Zillow clone today, the first thing I just wanted to cover was not necessarily a core user-facing feature, but instead I just wanted to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database, which will be used to power the rest of our product. Now, throughout our tutorial today, I've taken the time to create this checklist of all of the data types and fields that we're going to add into our database, as well as a long list of all of the features we're going to cover within our build today. And as you can see, this is a pretty damn extensive list. There truly is so much that I want to cover within this build. But what I love about using Notion is that it allows you to create a checklist of items which you can tick off as you add them into your bubble editor. And so that way you can just stay up to date with where you are throughout the build. Now, of course, I'm going to be sure to share a link to this within the description of this video, so that way you can easily make a duplicate of this template and follow along with me. But for the time being, I just wanted to quickly take the time to explain how we're going to set up our database. And when it comes to the process of creating a database in Bubble, particularly if you are brand new to the tool, it can definitely be overwhelming. There's a lot of things that you need to factor in within the beginning in order to get the rest of your application right. And so when it comes to the process of creating a database, before I add anything into my Bubble editor, I first like to sit down and think about what my data types and fields are going to be that I need to power my application. And that leads me to the very first point that I wanted to cover. When it comes to building out a database in Bubble, there's two key things you'll need to remember. When you're building a database, you'll have what's known as your data types and then your data fields. Now, your data types are the overall entities you create within your database. And you'll see here in my list that my data types are the larger headings. So we've got our user data type, we've got our property data type, we've got a property satellite data type, and even a form submission data type. And I'll explain what each of those are in a moment. But a data type is essentially an overall thing that your users will create inside your database. So when I do sit down and I think about how my application is going to be structured, the very first thing I like to do is think about what items are users going to create within our app. So users are going to want to create user accounts. So when they register an application, we're going to need to create an account for them in our database. If a user is, let's say, a real estate agent or a property manager, they'll most likely want to create a property listing. And so because they're creating a property, that's going to be an overarching thing that's going to be created. So that's a data type. Then when someone submits a contact form entry, so when someone wants to express that they're interested in a property, we're going to create a new form in our database, and that will be known as a form submission. And so these are all of the overarching things that users are going to create. And so these will be data types. And then inside of every data type, so every item created in your database, you'll want to store some information about that thing. And this is where your data fields come into play. And so you'll see below my data types, I have this checklist of items here, and these are my data fields. And your data fields will store all of the information you want about that particular thing. And so perhaps the best example is if I scroll on up to my user data type. So whenever someone creates a new user account, I might like to store some information about each person. So there's things like their name, their profile photo, their profile type. So are they a buyer or a seller? And then even things like a list of properties that they want to save inside of their account. And so all of this information is my data fields. And once again, before I ever open up Bubble, I like to sit down and just create a manual checklist here of all of the information I'd like to store under each data type. So that way, by the time that I actually do open up Bubble, I have a clear idea of everything I need to add into my database. And it just creates a much more succinct process when it comes to building your application from scratch. Now today, I am going to walk you through my thought process behind every single data type and data field as I actually add them into Bubble. So what we're going to do is open up a brand new Bubble editor here. So I've created a brand new application from scratch, and I haven't changed a single thing at this point in time. What we're going to do is open up our data tab, and straight away, what you'll notice is that under our data types menu option, we already have a pre-built user data type. And the reason why this already exists is because Bubble knows that when users actually need to register an account for your application, so whenever someone actually wants to use your app, they will need a user account. And so that's why your user data type comes standard with any application. So we actually don't need to create that. It's already built in for us. Now on the right hand side here to our data type, you'll see a list of items, and these are all of our data fields. So by default, our user data type actually comes with an email data field. And the reason for that is because once again, Bubble knows that by default, whenever someone signs up to your application, they'll need to either register or log in with an email and a password. So Bubble automatically stores an email data field for us under our user data type. It does also store a password field, but you just won't be able to see this in plain text for privacy reasons. However, it is there, so we don't need to create that. And so on the right-hand side, this is where you would add in all of your data fields under your user data type. However, before I add in any data fields, what I personally like to do first is add in all of my data types. And the reason for that is because what you'll find is that some data fields can actually link to different data types. So for instance, under my user data type, I have this data field known as saved properties. So whenever someone would like to actually bookmark a property and view it later, I'm storing a list of properties within this field. And of course, because I'm storing a list of properties, which my property being a separate data type, you can see how we need to link our data fields to our data types. And look, I know that if you're brand new to Bubble, that can definitely sound confusing. So I'm going to be sure to explain that in even more detail in a moment when we actually cross this bridge. But for the time being, the first thing I'd like to do is add in all of my data types, and I'll explain why I've created these. So we already have our user data type, but the next one will be a property. Now, I previously mentioned this just before, but if we're building something like a property marketplace, people are going to need to be able to create properties to list on that marketplace. And so users will be able to create property listings. So if I head over to my data type, I'm going to add in a new data type here, and I'm going to call this property. Now, one thing I should also point out is that when you create a data type, you should almost in absolutely every use case never use a plural. So this will always be the word property, not properties. And the reason for that is because although in our database we will store multiple properties, a user will only ever be able to create one property at a time. And the reason why I point this out is that because if you use a plural here, it's going to confuse you later on when you have to reference this data type. But I just wanted to point this out for the time being because I see a lot of people doing this when they start using Bubble. But please, please, please try and avoid using a plural when it comes to the name of your data type. After adding this data type in though, we're going to jump back to our Notion checklist. We're going to scroll on down and I'm going to select on my next data type. And this is known as my property satellite. And I know that I've probably already confused the hell out of you if you're brand new to Bubble. And this really isn't going to help because I'm going to add another layer of complexity into the whole process of creating a database. And so in order to explain why I've actually created this, I should first talk about how we're actually storing all of our data fields under our property data type. So as you can see here, our property data type has quite a few data fields. There's a lot of information that we need to store about each individual property. But thankfully, all of this information is relatively small. So there's things like the address, there's the bedroom count, which is a number, there's the bathroom count, which is also a number. Then there's things like the price, the year it was built. And look, all of this is relatively small and easy to load data. And that's completely fine because whenever we need to load a property, what Bubble will actually do is load all of the data fields under our property data type. And because this is all relatively light information, so just a couple of different numbers or some basic text, this information will load relatively quickly. But when it comes to larger data fields, so things like long form text, videos, or even a list of images, all of that data can take up quite a bit of space and it can start to slow your application down if you're loading a lot of properties at once. So let's say for instance, on our homepage of our Zillow clone, we wanted to display a list of 20 properties. Bubble would load every single data field for each one of those properties, even if we're not displaying the information of that specific data field on that page. And so this is why I've split my larger data fields into a separate data type. And the reason for that is because if we were loading 20 properties and I had to load 20 long form descriptions or 20 lists of additional images, and on our homepage, we actually don't need to display that information. We obviously only want to display that information when someone clicks on a property and is sent through to another page to view its full details. And so what I've done is I've actually split all of that larger information into a separate data type. And so that way, all of this larger data isn't going to bog down our property data type. And I know this might seem like a lot of work in the beginning when you're setting up your database, but trust me, it's going to help you get a lot more out of your application in the long-term performance. So it's so important to take this step right now. But thankfully, because I'm storing this information in a separate data type, I like to refer to that data type as a satellite, because technically this will be linked to a property. So you can see here, my last data field under my property data type is known as the full details. And later on, I'm going to create a link to my separate data type. And that's why I like to call this the property satellite. Because if you can think that my property data type is here, my property satellite is going to sit over here, and these are still going to connect to each other. So I've kind of got this satellite floating around in space, and it's going to contain all of the additional information inside of it. And whenever I need to retrieve that information, I can easily just talk to my satellite and ask it to send the relevant information back down to my main property data type. And later on throughout my tutorial, when I actually explain how we can show the full description of a property, as well as the list of additional images, this is going to make a lot more sense. But for the time being, I'm just going to add my property satellite data type into my database. So if I jump over into Bubble, I'm going to create a new data type, and I'm going to call this property satellite. I'll then choose to create this. Then if we jump back into Notion, I have one last data type, and this is known as our form submission. So whenever one of our users who's looking to buy a property today views the full information about a property listing that they might be interested in, I'm going to allow them to submit a contact form to the real estate agent who published that property. So that way they can book something like an inspection, or they can show their interest in buying that property, or even renting it for that matter. And so every single time someone creates a form submission, I'm going to need to store that in my database. So if we jump back over into Bubble, I'm going to create another data type called form submission, and then we'll create that. And thankfully, that is all of our data types we'll need to add into our database. There's actually not too many when it comes to our Zillow clone. However, there is one last thing I just need to cover before we go ahead and build out all of the data fields which will power our data types. And that is, if we scroll on down, you'll see I've referenced this list of option sets. Now, just when I know you're already confused enough, particularly if you are brand new to Bubble, I'm going to throw yet another spanner in the works. And I know you're probably thinking at this point, Lachlan, please just shut up and stop confusing me. But look, this truly is in your best interest to learn this, because it's going to make your life so much easier when it comes to building inside a Bubble. And if you're not familiar with option sets, so if you are relatively new to Bubble, it's my job to explain these in as much detail as possible, as well as try to simplify the whole process of understanding their core use. And the best way to understand what an option set is by referring to our data types. So within Bubble, under our data tab, you'll notice we have this menu option called data types, where of course we can add a data type like we've just done. And then in a moment, we'll add all of our data fields within our data types. But what you'll also notice is that we have this menu option known as option sets. Now look, if you want a further breakdown about what option sets are, there is this little tutorial that will help explain this. And look, trust me, my feelings will not be hurt if you still need to watch this tutorial after my explanation. But to be completely frank with you, an option set is kind of like a data type that your users are not able to create, and only you as the admin of your app can choose to create. And so if I was to just jump over into my Notion doc here, you can see I've got a series of different option sets. So things like the profile type, as well as the listing type, the property type, and property features. And the reason why I've created these as a list of option sets is because whenever someone, let's say, registers an account in our database, they're going to need to select what profile type they are. So are they a buyer or are they a seller? Now, if users were able to create their own profile type under a normal data type, this would give them the ability to type in whatever option they would want. So they could say that they're a seller, they could even say that they're an admin, or they could say that they're a seller but just add a typo into that. So you would start to see a lot of duplicate entries within your database. And so in order to control the options that users can select from, what we can do is create what's known as a list of option sets. And within this list, we as the admins will be the only people who can create the options that users choose. And so we're going to create two options. You can either be a buyer or a seller. You can't be anything else. And because users are selecting from these two options, we can just ensure that the quality of the way these are spelled is consistent, and it's just going to make it easier for our users to decide which account they have, because they only have to select from two options. They don't need to add in their own. And so this is the power of option sets. If you ever have any information in your app that you need to control as the admin, you should create that as an option set. Whereas if you want your users to create information, so things like creating a property or a form submission, that should be a data type. And so today, of course, I'll be sure to explain what each of these option sets does and the purpose behind them. But we'll start by adding our profile type option set into our database. And now the reason why I'm adding my option sets before my data fields is that because some of my data fields will also reference these option sets. So it's important to first build these out before we can then go on and create that link. So if I just jump into my bubble editor here, I'm going to create a new option set and I'm going to call this the profile type. Now what you'll even see here is that the process of creating an option set kind of looks like the process of creating a data type. So on the left-hand side, you've got the overarching thing. And then on the right-hand side, you can add in what looks like data fields. And so this is where I'm going to add my different options into this list. So there was my buyer option, and then there was my seller option. And now users will only ever be able to select from one of these two choices. They won't be able to freestyle it and add in whatever selection they want. They can only choose between these two. So it gives me more control as the owner of my application. Now for each of these option sets, we're just storing the title of these as the display text. And I just wanted to point this out because later on throughout our tutorial, if we ever need to reference our profile types, so if we want to add it in something like a drop-down menu, in order to display each of these options, we just need to reference the display text, which is just the text within the options we've just added. It's pretty self-explanatory. What we're going to do though is just jump back into our Notion checklist, tick off these two option sets, and then we'll head to our next one, which is known as our listing type. So if I jump back into Bubble, I'm going to create another option. I'll call this the listing type. We'll create that. And the purpose of this listing type is to once again have control over the options people select for a property listing. So is it either a property for sale or is it a rental property? And they're the only two options I want to support on my platform today. I don't want users to list that they're trying to sublease a property or they're trying to list it as a short-term rental. I'm only going to give them the two options. And that will once again just give me more control over how our users interact and engage with our platform. And so the two options within this list is first of all going to be the sale and then a rental. So when someone lists a property, there's going to be a drop-down menu and they can select from one of these two options. We'll jump back into Notion. We'll tick these two options off, and if we scroll on down, the next option set list is the property type. So we'll jump into Bubble, we'll type in the property type. I can see I just have a small typo there. I'll fix that up, and we'll choose to create this. And now the property type will once again just allow someone to select when they're listing a property, what type of property it is. So is it a townhouse? Is it a house? Is it an apartment? And again, the reason why I'm creating this as an option set list is because I want my users to only select from the options I provide. And the big benefit to that is, let's say, if I was to enable users to create the property type themselves, users might type in that they want to list a house. There's no guaranteeing that they would all spell the word house the same. Some users might add typos, others might add capital letters, and so there would be no consistency between all the options. And on our search results page, when someone actually searches for a property, we're going to create a series of filters which allows a user to determine what properties they want to view. So there's going to be a drop-down menu and they can filter through houses, apartments, or townhouses. And so because I'm in control of the three options that are going to display within that drop-down menu, it'll just enable us to filter all of the relevant properties in our database. Whereas if I was to display a drop-down menu based on items that users create for our property type, that would be a super long list because they would create all kinds of different stuff. And then if you were to filter through houses, if a user added a typo on their word house, it might not actually show up under that filter. And I know that this might sound confusing again, but when I build that feature out, you're going to see exactly what I mean. But for the time being, what we're going to do is add in our three options for this. So I'm going to add in a house, an apartment, and a townhouse. And when it comes to the townhouse, I might actually just make that one word there. But that's everything I want to include here. Now, I'm only using 3 examples today because I want to keep this relatively simple. But if you wanted to add in more options, so things like a loft, a warehouse, there's nothing stopping you from pausing this tutorial and adding those in now. But again, I just want to keep things relatively straightforward when it comes to the process of building our Zillow clone. Let's jump back into Notion though, tick off this list of option sets here, and the very last one is going to be our property features. So when someone lists a property today, we're going to give them the option to select from a long list of features that property includes. Now my list is actually going to be relatively short. I'm only going to include 4 options, but once again, you could include a longer list if you would like. So I just want users to be able to select if the property has something like air conditioner, a furnace, a garage, or even a pool. So I'm just going to jump into my bubble editor. I'm going to create another option set called property features. And within this, I'm going to add in all of those choices. So the first choice was air conditioning. I'll create that. Then there was a furnace, there was a garage, and then there was a pool. And look, once again, as I mentioned, I'm keeping this list relatively short, but you can also add in whatever additional features you would like. I'll then jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out all of those option sets. And that's everything we need to cover for this section of our database. The last thing we need to do is just add in all of our data fields, which are going to be used to power our data types. So we're going to start by focusing on our user data type. So every single time someone creates an account and uses that throughout our application, this is the information I'd like to store within that person's account at any point in time. So if we jump into Bubble, head to our data types tab, we're going to open up our user data type. And the first thing we're going to do is create a data field, which will be the user's name. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. We're just going to store a user's name. So that way we can reference them at any point throughout our app. Now, when you create a data field, you'll also see the option to give this field a type. So this is the format in which Bubble's going to store this data in your database. So you can select from text, a number, a date, an image, a file, and the list just goes on. But for now, the name is just going to be text. It's super straightforward. I'll choose to create this. And just like that, we have our first data field in our database. I'm then going to create another field, and I'm going to call this the profile photo field. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that when I've added two separate words here, within our data field, instead of adding a space between these two words, I've just added a dash. Now, there is a specific reason why I do this, and that is because when we go to reference our data fields later on inside of our Bubble editor, instead of using spaces, if I was to just use a dash, I can easily just tell what is the data field and then what is a data type. Because if you remember, all of my data types had spaces between the words, whereas my data fields will not. So that's just another little tip that I thought I'd give you now. Now for this field type, I'm going to set this to be an image because a user will be uploading a photo. I'll choose to create that. Now for our profile photo, what I'm also going to do is upload a default image. And the reason for that is because once a user registers an account, if they don't have a profile photo, what I'd like to do is just display a temporary photo in their place. And so that way I'll just avoid displaying no image at all. And so under our default option here, you'll see the option to upload an image. And so I'm just going to upload an image from my local device that I have here. And as you'll see, this image is kind of just like a default alias. Now, if you'd like to upload this same image that I've just used, what I've also done is I've taken the time to upload all of the assets we'll be using throughout our tutorial today into this Google Drive folder. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this within the description of this video. But you can see here, your user profile photo is easily accessible. So you can just download that and you can upload that into your database. I'm just going to close this for the time being because the next data field I'd like to add in is going to be the profile type that this user is. So are they someone who's looking to buy properties or are they someone looking to sell properties? And so I'm going to create a data field here and I'm going to call this profile type. Now, when it comes to this field type, I'd actually like to link this to my option set list that we had just created. Because if you remember in that list, we'd already created our two options. And so this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble's database come to life. It's at this point that we can start linking our data fields to separate data types or even option sets. And that's what's known as creating a relational database. But if I was to take all that jargon away, it just means that all of your different data points can talk to each other inside of your app. So for this field type, I'm going to select that this should be our profile type option set list. I'll create this, and I'm also going to give this a default value. So you'll see here in this drop-down menu, we can select one of the two options that we have pre-created. So there was our buyer and there was our seller. Now by default, when someone registers an account, I'd like to list that they should be a buyer. And then later on, we're going to build out a feature that allows someone to upgrade their account to become a seller. So if they're a real estate agent or a property manager, they'll then have additional features where they can list properties. But for now, that's all we'll need to create. The next data field is going to be known as saved properties. And this data field is going to be used when we create our bookmarking feature. So let's say if someone's viewing a list of properties within our search results page and they just want to save a property to view later, what they're going to do is click a little bookmark button, and I'd like to save that property within this list. So for this field type, I'm going to select that this should be a property, and I'm also going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries, because a user should be able to save more than one property into their account. So right now I'm going to save a list of properties. I'll then choose to create this. And finally, there's 2 additional data fields I'd like to add into my user data type. And these data fields are going to be used for those who are listed as sellers in our application. So it's more for the real estate agents and property managers of our app. And the first data field is just going to be called contact number. So when someone upgrades their account to become a seller in our platform, I'm going to display some additional fields that they can store some extra information in. So that way, if they add their contact number, someone can actually contact this real estate agent and ask them about a listing. Now, contrary to what you might think, this field type is just going to be a text value, not a number. The only instance you'd select to add a number is if you ever want to perform a calculation or use that number as a filter. But in this case, I'm just going to actually display someone's number. I'm not going to perform a calculation on it. So this is just going to be plain text. I'll choose to create that. And then finally, there's one last field, which is called the agency name. So when someone upgrades to become a seller, they'll be required to add in their real estate agent name, or I should say the name of their real estate business. And so for this field type, it's also just going to be a text type. It's super straightforward. Now that's everything I need to add into my user data type. So we're going to jump over to our Notion checklist and tick off all of these options here. And then we can move on down to our property data type. And this is where a lot of the information is going to be stored today. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our property data type, the very first field I'd like to create is going to be known as the address. And this address field type is actually going to be a geographic address, which later on will allow us to integrate this with Google Maps. So that way we can reference real world addresses within our own app. I'll select that and I'll choose to create this. Then below this, I'd like to create another new field. And this is going to be known as our bedroom count. So every single time someone lists a property, they're going to need to store how many bedrooms this property has. And for this field type, I would actually like this to be a number, because later on when we create our search results page, we're going to allow people to filter down properties based on their bedroom count. So if, let's say, someone only wants to search for a property with more than 2 bedrooms, because this is a number, we could exclude any property with less than 2 bedrooms. And I'll explain that in more detail later on. But for the time being, I'm just going to set that as a number and I'll create that. I'll then do the exact same thing, but we'll be calling this our bathroom count. So once again, this field type is going to be a number. We can choose to create this. Then for every property, I'd also like to create a field known as the featured image. Now, this is just going to be a single image, which is kind of like the thumbnail image for the property that's going to display on things like your homepage and your search results page. And because this field is only going to be a single image, I am going to add this to my main property data type, because a single image isn't going to take too long to load. However, a long list of images would. And so for this field type, I'm going to set this to be an image. I'll choose to create that. Then for every property, I'd also like to determine what either its sell price will be or its monthly rental price will be. So I'm going to create 2 separate fields here. The first one is going to be called sell price. And this field type will be a number, because later on we're going to store that as a currency. And you can perform calculations on things like numbers. I'll create this. But of course, not every property is going to be a property for sale. We're also going to have rental properties. So I'm going to need to create a way to store the monthly rental price as opposed to the total sell price. So I'm going to create a separate data field here. And I'm going to call this data type the monthly rental price. And this will once again be a number. I can choose to create that. Then as we're working our way through the list, the next field I'd like to create is going to be the year that this property was built. Now I am going to set this as a number, because once again, you could create a search filter later on where a user can only display properties that were built after a certain date. And so if we store that year built as a number, it will allow us to do that. I'll create this. The next field will be relatively similar. It's going to be a number, but in this case, it's going to determine the square footage of each property. So this will be the actual size of the property. And this will once again be a number, because I'd like to either perform a calculation or use that number as a filter later on, we'll create this. The next field we'll create is then going to be called is available. So when someone lists a property, by default, it should be visible on our platform. So it will be available. However, if let's say someone actually buys that property, today we're going to create a feature that allows our real estate agents or our property managers to update that property as sold or leased. So it would no longer be available on the market. And so this is available status. Its field type will be a yes/no choice because a property is going to be available or it's not going to be available. I'm going to choose to create this. And what we'll also do is update the default value of this field to be yes. So that way, whenever a property is listed, it automatically is available and it should be visible on our marketplace. From here, our next data field will be known as the listing type. So this will determine if the property is a property that's for sale or if it's one that is a rental. And this field type is going to reference our listing type option set list where we had already pre-created those two options. So I'm going to select to create this here, and I won't give this a default value. I'll allow our real estate agent to determine what it is when they list that property. I then like to create another field, which is going to be called the property type. So this will determine if the property is a house, an apartment, or a townhouse. And of course, we'd already pre-created those options as another option set list. So if we open up our field type, we're going to scroll on down to our property type. We'll select that and choose to create that. And once again, we're not going to give this a default value because we'll allow our real estate agents to do that whenever they actually list a property. We can then choose to create yet another data field. And this one's going to be called property features. And you might have guessed by now, but this is going to link to our property features data type. So when someone lists a property, they can select all of the different features that this property will have. So will it have air conditioner? Will it have a garage or even a pool? And because a property can have more than one feature, I'm going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries. So that way a real estate agent can select from as many options as they would want from our main option set list. I'll choose to create that there. And at this point, we're almost at the end of our property data type. There's just a few additional fields we'll need to add. The next one is going to be called views. So every single time someone views the full information for this property, what I'd like to do is increase the view count. So later on, when we build out a dashboard page for our real estate agents to manage each property, they can see how many views a property has received, as well as how many saves a property has received. And we're going to build out that saves field next. For this field type, I'd like this to be a number because we're going to be keeping count of something. I'll choose to create this. Then, as I mentioned, I'd like to create another field and I'll call this saves. So every single time someone bookmarks a property, I'd like to increase the total count of saves that property has received. So for this field type, it will also be a number because we'll be performing calculations on this field. And then finally, there is one last data field we'll need to create, and that is going to be a field that actually links our main property data type through to our satellite data type. So this is where we can create that connection that allows us to pull data from our satellite whenever we need it. And so I'm going to create an additional field here, and I'm going to call this the full details field because this is where we're going to reference the full details stored in our satellite. And this field type will be linked to our separate property satellite data type. And when we create that, we can now build a connection between those two data types. It truly is as simple as that. And thankfully, that is all of the data fields we need to add under our property data type. I know there was quite a lot here. So we're going to jump back into our Notion checklist. Once again, highlight all of these data fields and tick that we've finished adding those in. And we're almost down to the bottom of our list. The next data fields we'll need to add in is under our property satellite data type. And thankfully, this one is relatively straightforward. We're going to jump back into Bubble, open up our property satellite, and we're going to choose to create a field here, which will be known as the full description. Now, the reason why I've stored this full description in our satellite is because when it comes to the description of a property, there's no telling how long this is going to be. A real estate agent could write a couple of sentences, or they could write a short novel. It's really up to their interpretation about how much information they want to list for this property. And look, if you are storing quite a large bit of free text, this can take up quite a bit of data for Bubble to actually store. And so that's why I just want to store this field under our property satellite data type. And this field type is just going to be a text type. It is super straightforward. I'll choose to create this. And then finally, I'd also just like to add in a list of additional images that a real estate agent could upload for this property. And so I'm going to create a field here, and I'm just going to call this images. This field type will be an image, but I'm going to tick this option to make this a list with multiple entries, because as I just mentioned, someone could upload a full list of images. We'll then create that. And that is all of the data fields we'll need to add under this data type. I'll then jump back into Notion, tick these two fields off, and we have one very last data type we need to build out, and that is our form submission. So back in our database here, we're going to open up our form submission data type, and we're going to create a new field here. And the very first field we're going to add in this is going to be called the contact name. So every single time a user submits a form, I'm going to have them write in the name of the person that the real estate agent should contact. And so this field type is going to be super straightforward. It's just going to be a text field. And by adding this contact name in as a separate field, it allows someone to also add in that they're contacting a real estate agent on someone else's behalf. So if, let's say, I listed a property and you wanted to submit a contact form entry, but you didn't want to use your name, you wanted to use the name of your partner or a friend, this would allow you to store their name in this. So that way you can submit this on their behalf. I'll choose to create this here. I'm then going to create another field which would be called contact number. Now this is going to be used for the exact same purpose. This field type will just be a text field because I'm not performing a calculation or anything on this number. It's going to be super straightforward. I'll then do the exact same thing for the email. So I'll call this contact email, and this will once again be a text type. And because we're storing this as its own separate field, a user by default won't have to use the email associated with their account. Instead, they could add in whatever email address they would like. So that way, if they have a preferred email address that you should contact them on, they can easily add that in. I'll then choose to create this. I'd also like to create another field which is known as the message for this form. So whenever someone submits a contact form, they should be able to type in a short message about a question they might have about this property. So asking when it's available for inspection or asking if the price is negotiable. And so I'm going to create a field known as the message, and I'm going to set this field type to be a text option. It's going to be super straightforward. And then finally, for every form that is submitted, I'd also like to reference which property this form was submitted against. So that way, when a real estate agent opens up a dashboard, they can see which contact form is related to which specific property that they've listed. So I'm going to create a field here, and I'm going to link this back to an original property. And to abbreviate that, I'm just going to call this OG property. And this will link to our property data type. So if I scroll on down, I'll select the property option. I can choose to create that. And just like that, that is everything we'll need to add into our form submission data type. So we can jump back over to our Notion checklist, tick all of these options off here, and that actually concludes all of the data fields we'll need to add into our database. However, there is just one very last thing I just need to cover within our Bubble editor here, and that is that under our data types here, you may have noticed that our user data type has this text saying that it has some privacy rules applied to it by default. Now, if I was to click on this, it's going to take you through to your privacy tab. And what you'll see is that, as I just mentioned, it does have a default privacy rule attached to it. Now, if you're new to Bubble, to put things into the most simplest terms possible, this privacy rule as it stands right now only allows users to view the information that they create themselves. Now, while that might be handy for things like internal tools or project management software, when you're building something like a marketplace where you want someone to create, let's say, a property listing, and then for everyone else to be able to view that, this is not the experience we want to create. So what we're going to do is actually head over to this little trash can icon and click this, and we're going to delete that privacy rule. And now what you'll see is that our user data type is publicly visible. And if you are new to Bubble, please take the time to do this now. I really don't want you to be that person who messages me when you go to run a preview of your app and you say that you can't view any properties, when in fact you just haven't taken the time to delete this privacy rule. But this is just something important that I wanted to point out now at the beginning of our tutorial. But look, for now, that is absolutely everything we'll need to cover within this section of our tutorial today. I know it did take quite a bit of time to build out our database, but as I mentioned, once we've set this up, this will be used to power the rest of our entire application. So that's why it's so important to take care of building your database out first. After taking the time to configure our database, we can move on down to the list of features I have set out for us in our Notion checklist. And as you'll see, this list is quite extensive. I truly don't want to spare any detail when it comes to our Zillow clone. Now, at the very top of my list, I just want to take a moment to start building out the Zillow homepage. So this is going to be the main page of our app that users will land on whenever they open it. And for this page, I've broken this down into two separate sections. The first section is going to cover how we can actually design the main crux of the page itself. And then from there, I have a separate module which is going to cover how we can build a navigation menu, which will sit at the top of our page. Now, when it comes to the Zillow homepage, if I was to open up the real world product, there's actually not a lot happening on this homepage in comparison to some other apps that I've created. So at the top of our page, you can see this navigation menu, which as I mentioned, we're going to build out in a separate module. But below that, we have almost like this hero section where we've got an image, we've got some text as well as a search bar. And then below that, we just have a list of featured properties. And so thankfully, when it comes to building this whole experience, it's not too difficult inside a Bubble. But of course, your boy's going to explain everything in as much detail as I can. So if we were to jump into our Bubble editor, I'm going to open up our index page. So within our page dropdown, you'll see that by default, you have a page created called your index page. Now, this is the default homepage for your application. So whenever a user opens this app, this is the page they will be sent to. And as you can see, at this point in time, this page is blank. There's nothing on it. And so before we start to build out all of the elements to replicate the real world Zillow product, we're just going to need to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. And the very first thing we'll need to do is just configure the layout style of our page. And so what do I mean by that? If I was to double click on my page, it'll open up our property editor. And inside a Bubble, this is where you can customize all of your elements. So you'll see here that you can customize things like the background color of our page. But within this, we also have what's known as our layout tab. And this is just going to determine how the page is structured and displayed to your end users. And if we were to dive deeper into our layout tab, you'll see this option here known as the container layout. Now, this is incredibly important when it comes to building applications in Bubble. So the container layout will determine in which order elements are displayed across your page. Now, the word container is used because when you think about it, your page is like a big container. So if you were thinking of something like a Tupperware container, it's this box that contains all of the ingredients inside of it. And so any elements you add onto the page, so things like buttons, images, text, they're going to be all of the ingredients that sit inside this overall container. So our page is kind of like a house for all of those elements. Now, if we were to open up this drop-down menu, you'll see 4 options. And if you're brand new to Bubble, I know that can be super confusing. Thankfully, when it comes to building in Bubble, I actually only ever use 2 of these 4 options. So if we scroll on down to the bottom, you'll see this option known as a row and the other known as a column. And what's the difference between these 2 options? The best way to illustrate this is by adding some elements onto my page. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements, and by all means, you don't need to do this. This is just for an example. But I'm just going to add 2 button elements onto my page. So I can click and add these absolutely anywhere. Then if I was to click on my page once again and open up my layout tab, if I was to set the container layout of my page to be a row, you'll see that these 2 buttons will be placed side by side. So they're going to be scaled horizontally across our page. So that's what a row means. A row just means it's going to position elements side by side. If we were to open up this dropdown and select the column option, however, you'll now see that it does the opposite. So it's going to stack elements vertically, not horizontally. So now you'll see our 2 button elements are stacked on top of each other. And the reason why I just wanted to take the time to explain this is because when you're building fully responsive applications inside a Bubble, it's important to understand the difference between both a row and a column container layout. And look, when it comes to the overall structure of our page, in 99% of scenarios, I will use a column layout. Because when you think of it, any website or modern application are always built from the top down. So if we were to look at the real world Zillow product here, you'll see that at the top of the page, it has this navigation menu. Then stacked below that is this hero section. Then stacked below that is this list of properties. Now, of course, as you'll see within the navigation menu, we do have things like our text menus that are stacked horizontally across our page. But when it comes to the overall page structure, everything is stacked on top of each other. And we'll learn how we can stack things horizontally even though we have a vertical page structure in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to focus on building out this hero section here. And so if we jump back into Bubble, we're going to leave our container layout as a column. Then from here, I'm just going to select my two buttons and choose to delete these. And it's at this point in time that we can now start building out the actual crux of our homepage. And so on our homepage, the first thing we'll need to add is this image here you see within the hero section of Zillow's app. Now inside of this image, what I can actually see is that it stores some text. So as you can see, we've got this heading as well as a search bar that are placed on top of the image. And the reason why I just wanted to point that out is because back in Bubble, if I was to head to my visual elements and let's say add an image element onto my page and then also add a text element, what you'll see is that because our overall page structure is set to that column container layout, both of these elements are actually going to stack on top of each other. Whereas as you just saw on the real world Zillow product, we want this text to be positioned inside of this image, not below it. So how can we do that? Thankfully in Bubble, there's an element known as a group, and these are going to be your new best friend inside of Bubble. Throughout our whole tutorial today, you're going to see me reference groups multiple times. So by the end of this tutorial, you'll be incredibly familiar with them. If I scroll on down to my containers menu here, before I add in my image or my text, I'm going to add a group element onto my page. Now, what is a group? A group is kind of like a mini page inside of your overall page. So similar to how our overall page was a container, meaning it could contain all of the elements inside of it, our group will also act like another container, hence why it was in the containers menu. And so if this group here is like a small page within my existing page, that means that if I was to head over to my layout tab, I also have the ability to update the container layout, and I can choose between a row and a column. And so if you ever wanted to stack elements horizontally across your page, you could add a group onto your page and set the container layout to be a row because it would stack elements side by side. Now for our example today, I do want to select a column option because when we look at Zillow here, the way I see this is we've got one big group and the background image of that group is this house that you see. Then inside of that group, we've got this text element followed by this search bar. So these two elements are stacked on top of each other, which means when we're stacking elements vertically, we need to set the container layout to be a column. And before we add those elements in, I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab of this group because I'd like to upload a custom background image. And that image is going to be the house you just saw in Zillow. So I'm going to select to detach the style of this group. And when it comes to the background style, I'm going to select that this should be an image. And from here, I'm going to upload a static image that I have on my local device. Now, if you wanted to get access to the same image that I'm going to be uploading in my example today, what I've done is I've taken the time to upload all of the image assets we'll be using throughout our tutorial into this Google Drive folder. So you can download these and follow along. But you'll see inside of this, we have our hero image, we have our Zillow logo, and we've got a couple of different icons we're going to use later on. But for the time being, if I was to just close this and jump back into Bubble, as you can see at this point in time, this group element doesn't really show the full image, and that's because it doesn't span across the full width of our page. And so it's at this point that we're going to need to make this group fully responsive. So if we were to jump into our layout tab, what you'll see is the settings to customize things like the width and the height of any element you're working with. And if we wanted to make this element fully responsive across our page, what we'd need to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. And so what this means by being a fixed width is that this group is going to take up 280 pixels across our page. So this is this width that you see here. And because it is a fixed width, it's going to be no larger or no smaller. So it's always going to be this exact size you see right here inside your editor. And that's not the experience we want to create. So what we're going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. We're going to set the minimum width here to be 0, and we're going to leave the maximum width as infinite. So what that means is that at the smallest possible size, this element will take up 0 pixels. So that means it can shrink down to the smallest possible size imaginable. Then when it comes to the maximum width, if we set that as infinite, this means it's going to continually scale across our page regardless of the user's browser size. And so if I was to quickly just jump into my responsive tab here, what you'll see is that this group will continually expand in and out regardless of the size of the page. And so this is where we can create a fully responsive experience. Now, traditionally when I work with elements, you'll also need to update the minimum height and also the maximum height. But for this group, what I'd like to do is set the minimum height here to be 300 pixels. And by doing that, I'm just saying at the smallest possible size for the height of this element, it's going to be 300 pixels, which is this height that you see here. Now, there's no scientific reason why I selected 300 pixels. That's purely just a personal preference. I think that that's enough to show the actual image of the house, as well as add in the room to display the two elements I want to include. So that's our text element and our search box. And so right now you can start to see the hero section of our page coming together nicely. If I just jump back into my UI builder here, the next thing I'll need to add into this group is the text element. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element and add this into my image. And you can just faintly see that it's sitting inside the top left-hand corner. And if I wanted to replicate the same heading from the real world Zillow product, this will just display the words, find it, tour it, own it. So I'm just going to jump back into Bubble and I'll type that in. So I'll say find it, tour it, own it. Very inspirational. Then from here, what I'm going to do is actually choose to customize the style of this text before we then update the responsive settings for it as well. So if I was to scroll on down here, what I'm going to do is choose to detach the style of this text. And the first thing I'm going to change is the font. The font I'm looking for is known as Tinos, so Tinos. And that's just going to look more in line to the same styling as the text used in the real world Zillow product. I'm then going to also update the font size here to be 40. I'll then choose to align this text in the center of the element. I'll also choose to bold this text and update the color of this to be white. Now, although this text is white, I still can't really see the outline of it within our hero section. So what I'm going to do is just scroll on down and select this option to show the text shadow. And what this is going to do is add a faint shadow behind the text, but it's still set to white. Whereas what I'd like to do is set this to be a shade of black. So I'm going to add in my own custom black color code here. So if you'd like that, it's 565656. I'm also then just going to update the horizontal offset here. I'm going to set this to be 2, just so that way the shadow is slightly more recognizable. And then from here, we're going to need to make our element fully responsive. So once again, if we head over to our layout tab, you'll see the options to update the width of this element. Now, similar to our hero image, what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. And I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this text element is going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can on my page. I'm also then going to update the minimum height here to be 0. And the reason I'm doing that on our text element is because we have this option selected by default to fit the height of the actual element to the content inside of it. And that just means that the text element is going to collapse nicely around all of the text that sits inside of it. Now, today when I create responsive experiences within Bubble, you're going to see me leverage these exact same settings time and time again. In fact, it's probably going to become so repetitive that you're going to be sick of me saying it. But you just need to remember that in order to create a fully responsive experience, your minimum width should be 0 and your maximum width should be infinite. So that way elements can take up as little or as much space as they can on the page. The only other thing I'd like to change when it comes to this text element is the margins around it. So the margins just allow you to add some spacing. So that way this text element doesn't sit directly at the top of our page. And when it comes to the margins, I'm just going to add in 50 pixels of margin at the top. I won't add any on the bottom, but I'll also add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element won't touch the borders of the group that it sits within. And now below this text element, we're just going to add in a search box, which of course will allow someone to search for a location. And later on, that's going to power a custom search feature that we create. So in order to add this search field, I'm going to scroll on down to my input forms, and you'll see the option to add in an element known as a search box. And the very first thing I'm going to change when it comes to this search box is not any of the design or responsive settings. Instead, I'm just going to update the name of this. So I'm going to call this search box location. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because whenever I work with input fields inside a Bubble, it's so important to take the time to name these properly. Because when you create workflows later on, you're going to need to reference the values stored within input fields. And in order to recognize which input fields you should select from, giving the right naming conventions will save you a massive amount of time and stress. So it's important to do these as you add them onto your page. And you'll see me do that a lot throughout our tutorial today. Before we also update the design settings, we're also just going to need to configure the actual search settings for this search field. So what you'll see here within our search field is this option known as our choices style. So when it comes to a search field, you can add in a list of static choices, which you can type in. And then if a user wanted to perform a search, they could start typing something in and search through all of the options you list. You could also have a list of dynamic choices, which I won't confuse you too much right now, but that essentially just links to your database. So that way users can search for information stored inside of your Bubble app. But today what I'm interested in doing is selecting this option known as geographic places. And what this is automatically going to do is connect our search field to Google Maps. So now users will have the ability to search through real world addresses and things like cities, suburbs, and countries. And that's all taken care of for us inside of Bubble. The only thing I should point out is that what you might see at this point in time is two issues within your Bubble app. So if I was to select on this and open up my issue checker, what you'll see is that Bubble's just prompting me to source my own Google Maps API keys. And now what that essentially just means is that every single time one of our users wants to search for a location or an address, our Bubble app's going to communicate with Google Maps just to verify what that address format is. And then Google Maps is going to send some information back to our Bubble app. And so that's where the power of an API will come into place. Now, thankfully, when it comes to sourcing your own API keys, it's a super straightforward process. It might sound technical, but you actually don't need to write any code for this. If you were to actually just select on the issue within your issue checker, it's going to take you through to your settings page and open up your general settings. And if I was to just close my issue checker and then scroll on down my page, what you'll see is this section here for your Google Maps API keys. And right here, you'll see there's two input fields. So you need to source two API keys. And thankfully, Bubble's already taken the time to write some thorough documentation that explains exactly how to get these. So if you just select on this linked document here, what you'll see is Bubble's documentation page, which includes a video tutorial, as well as written instructions on how you can source your own API keys. Now this process is super straightforward, so I'd recommend just pausing this tutorial here and following that from Bubble's end. I'm not going to dabble too much into that because this tutorial already does a great job of explaining everything. Whereas what I want to focus on today is building out the rest of our Zillow homepage. So I'm just going to choose to close this now, jump back into my design tab, and now we can finish the process of designing our custom search field. And the very first thing I want to do is just update the placeholder text that sits inside of this search field. So placeholder text is just the text inside of the field that's just displayed until someone actually clicks in this and starts typing in something of their own. And if I was to copy the real world Zillow clone here, you'll see that this text displays something like enter an address, neighborhood, city, or zip code. And so what I'm going to do today is just create a simplified version of that. So I'm just going to say enter an address, neighborhood, etc. And when we update the background color of our search field, you'll see that text displayed in a moment. So in order to customize that color, we're going to scroll on down to our style. We're going to detach the default style here. And when it comes to the background style, I'm going to set this to be a flat color and we'll be leaving that as white. And when it comes to our styling, that's all I'm going to change for our search field. I will just jump over to our layout tab because we'll now need to make this element fully responsive. And so similar to before, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. So that way this search field can collapse down to the smallest possible size. However, when it comes to the maximum width, you'll see here that when it's set to infinite, this search field's going to take up all of the width across my page. And this just looks a bit silly. Whereas what I'd like it to do is only just take up a small section of our homepage. So in order to create that experience, I'm going to need to actually set a maximum width. So that way Bubble knows to not allow this search field to be larger than a certain width that we give it. And that width is going to be 500 pixels. Now, once again, there's no scientific reason why I selected 500 pixels. I just think that that's enough to display a reasonably sized search field. And when it comes to the height, I am also going to leave this as the default option. So you'll see here that the height is fixed at 48 pixels, which just means that the height is always going to be this size. It's not going to be any smaller or larger. And look, I'm pretty happy with that experience. This looks like a great input field. The only other thing I will need to do is just horizontally align this element in the center of my page, which obviously just means it's going to center it. And then finally, I'll add in some margins so that way there's a little bit of space between my text element above it there. And so if I scroll on down here to my margin settings, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top. I won't add any on the bottom, but I'll also add in 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that is all of the elements we'll need to add into our hero section. In a later section of our tutorial, we are going to build out a workflow that's going to power this search experience. So that way we can send someone through to a search results page and then show a list of all of the relevant properties to their search. But for the time being, I just want to finish off building our homepage here. And so below our hero section, I just like to display a list of properties that are near the current user. And before I add in that list, I'm just going to add a small heading that will sit above it. So if I just scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab another text element here. And this is going to display the words homes near you. Now, when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to detach the style of this. I will update the font size to be 18. And I'm also going to choose to bold this text, just so that way it stands out like a heading. I'll then need to make this element fully responsive. So if we jump into our layout tab, similar to before, we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now our text element will take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. For the height of this element, I can see that we've got quite a bit of empty space at the bottom of this. So if I set the minimum height to 0, we have this default option selected, which is just going to collapse the height of this element around the text that sits inside of it. Finally, I'm also going to add in some margin around this text element, so that way it doesn't touch the group that sits above it. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And now from here, we can add in an element that's going to display a list of properties that are located near the current user. Now, when it comes to displaying lists inside of Bubble, there's a special element that's going to do this, and it will also become your new best friend throughout the process of building. So if we scroll on down to our containers menu, you'll see this element known as a repeating group. And as you can see, this element looks just like a list, or kind of something like a Google Sheet or an Excel sheet, where you've got a series of different rows right now. And so repeating groups in Bubble allow you to display lists of items. And perhaps the best way to explain this is by giving you a real world example of when you might use a repeating group. So let's say you were building something like a social network app, so something like Instagram, where you wanted to display a feed of posts on your homepage, so a feed of images or videos. Because all of your users would have taken the time to upload posts into your database, a repeating group is actually the element you would use to display a list of images. Or I should say a list of those posts. And so within our repeating group, you can see here, it just visualizes things like the repeating group item number 1, the item number 2, the item number 3, and so on. And so if this was our Instagram homepage feed, the very first cell in our repeating group would display the first photo that someone has uploaded. The second cell would be the second photo. The third cell would be the third photo, and so on. So each of these would be their own individual posts. And that is the power of repeating groups. It just allows you to dynamically display a list of information stored in your database. And by the word dynamic, I just mean that it's going to be different for every single user. So in our Zillow clone today, let's say you live in America, whereas I live in Australia. When you open up this application, you'll want to see a list of homes that are near your location. And so your location is going to be completely different to mine, which means you'll need to be displayed homes based in the United States, whereas I would see homes based within Australia. And so that's where you can really start to see the power of Bubble coming to life. It just allows you to create a truly custom experience for every single user at scale. And look, if you are new to Bubble, repeating groups can definitely be confusing to get your head around. It took me quite a bit of time to understand the concept in the beginning, but as we build this element out, I'm going to be sure to explain everything I can in as much detail as possible. So the very first thing we're going to need to do is jump into our Appearance tab. And the reason for that is because we're going to need to configure the data source for this repeating group. And so if we want to display a list of items from our database, we just need to identify what items we actually want to show. And so if I open up the type of content, what I'd like to do is display a list of properties. So I'm going to select on our property data type that we had previously created. Then when it comes to the data source, this is just going to allow Bubble to determine of all the properties in our database, which ones should we display to each user. So for our data source, I'm going to perform a search through our entire database for all of the properties, where first of all, the location of this property is within a certain radius of the current user. So the person who is logged in and wants to see a list of properties near them. So I'm going to add a constraint here, and I'm going to only display all of the properties where the address of the property is within. And now you can customize this to whatever proximity you would like, but I'm just going to set mine as 50 kilometers. So I'm just going to type in the number 50. Again, you can make this whatever you would like. You can make it 100 kilometers, 200 miles, because what you'll now need to do is select the formatting of this distance. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be using kilometers because I use the metric system, but you could also select miles if you would like. And so now I'm going to display a list of properties where the address is within 50 kilometers of, and we'll now need to select the current user's location. And so what we can do is scroll right down to the bottom here, and you'll see the option to select the current geographic position. So that's automatically going to pull the location of a user through their browser. And so that will just ensure that we display a list of relevant properties to that user's current location. Now, the other thing I'd like to do is add another constraint, because I'd only like to display a list of properties that are currently available. I don't want to display any properties that are off market. So if I was to scroll on down to this is available option, I'm only going to display properties where the is available status equals yes, meaning this property is currently available. Now, when it comes to the sorting of these properties, I'm going to choose to sort these in a random order. So if I scroll right down to the bottom, you'll see the option to select the random sorting. And what that's going to do is just ensure that each property has an even amount of distribution. So it's going to randomly display properties to any user at any point in time. But of course, all of those properties must meet these constraints here. Now, that is how we can configure our data source for our repeating group. So at this point in time, we've created a truly custom experience for our end users. But now we need to actually format this repeating group. So if I was to jump into the real world Zillow product and just scroll on down to the list of properties here, what you can see is that each property is displayed almost like within this little card or this tile here. And inside of that tile, we've got things like an image. So this is the featured image of that property. We've then got the price, as well as some information about this property, and of course the address of that property. And so in order to replicate this experience, if we jump into Bubble, we're just going to need to first configure a couple of different settings within our repeating groups. And repeating groups, unlike traditional elements, do have a few extra settings. And this is where things will get quite complex. And so right now, if I was to look at these settings, this repeating group has a fixed number of rows set to 4 and a fixed number of columns set to 1. So what this means is, let's say we had 20 properties that should be displayed to a user that's near them. Right now, it's only going to display 4 of those items because we have a fixed number of rows to be 4. And that's not the experience we want to create. We want to display as many or as little properties that are relevant to this user as possible. So I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed number of rows. I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns, because at this point in time, there's only going to be one property on each line in our repeating group. Whereas if I unselect this, what you'll see in a moment is that it's going to display a full grid of homes. Now, when we're working within our repeating group element, we'll just quickly jump to our layout tab, and we'll update the width settings so that way you can just take up the full width of our page. And the reason I'm doing this now is because I obviously don't really have much space to work within our repeating group. So I just need to change this. So when it comes to the width, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Now later on, I will come back and update the height settings. But while we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to update the container layout of this repeating group. And so inside of our repeating group, you'll see a bunch of different cells. So each little square here is going to be a different home that's displayed. So you'll see that right now it would be displaying quite a few. And inside of each cell is a little group. And each one of these cells inside of our repeating group is a group in its own. So that's where it gets the name from, a repeating group, because it's just a series of groups that repeat and share data. And so you can choose to update the container layout for all of the items inside of each group. Now I'm going to be setting this to be a column because I'm going to be stacking elements inside of this from top to bottom. But while we're also configuring our repeating group, I'm just going to jump over to my appearance tab once again. And I'm just going to change the settings here for the minimum height of the row as well as the minimum width of each column. And the reason for that is because right now the minimum settings are set to be 100 by 100. So that's why we have lots of little squares. Now, when I'm working with repeating groups, what I like to do is just start by setting the minimum height of each row to be 300 and the minimum width of each column to also be 300. Now, there's nothing scientific about this just yet. The reason why I've selected 300 by 300 is because, as you'll see, it's going to give me more space to work within. What I do tend to find with repeating groups is that they're just a matter of trial and error. So you'll often find that you'll have to come back and update some of these dimensions here and there in order to get the perfect configurations in the end. And that is completely fine. Look, I've been using Bubble for 4 years and I still have to do that. And of course, I'll be sure to explain my thought process as I walk through this. But at this point in time, look, I'm pretty happy with how the repeating group is looking right now. What I'm interested in doing is adding in, as I mentioned before, this tile or this card that's going to display all of the details of each property. So if we jump back into Bubble, what I'm going to do is first of all add a group element into my repeating group. And the reason for that is because our group is going to be this card. So it's going to be this white container that has all of this information inside of it. And I can also see that there's this nice little shadow around that group. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to head to our containers menu and we're going to add a group element inside of our repeating group. Now, what I love about repeating groups is that whatever you customize in the first cell will automatically duplicate across every other cell. And perhaps the best way to illustrate that is just by showing you what happens when I change the design of this white group. So when it comes to this group, I'll head to my style and choose to detach the default style. For the style here, I'm just going to set the roundness of this group to be 5, which just means that it's going to have some curved borders. For the shadow style, I'm going to set this to be an outset. And this is where you can now start to see that our repeating group cells are mimicked across our entire repeating group. And that's all I'll need to change for the design settings of this white group. What I will need to do though is update the responsive settings of this, because right now I can see it's only taking up a small fraction of the space that it has. Whereas I'm going to want this to take up as much space as it can. So if we jump to our layout tab, the first thing I'm going to do is update the container layout for this group. So once again, groups are like mini pages within your overall app. So these are going to store a bunch of different elements, and these elements will be stacked from top to bottom. Because if I jump into Zillow, I can see at the top here we have our image, below that we have our price, and then all of the additional information. And look, all of these elements are stacked on top of each other. So in Bubble, I'm going to set the container layout of this group to be a column. We'll then need to update the responsive settings of the width for this group. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite. So now this group is going to take up as little or as much space as it can within each repeating group cell. Now for the height, I will come back and update this in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to add all of my elements inside of it. And the reason for that is because if I was to now set the minimum height to be 0, you'll see that because we have this default option selected to fit the height of our element to the content inside of it, when there's no content inside of it, it's just going to disappear. So that's why I traditionally wait until I finished adding all of my elements inside of the group before I then come back and change this height. The only other thing we're going to do while we're here is just add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this group. So the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And now you'll see that that's going to evenly space these out inside of my repeating group. Now inside of our group here, we're going to start by adding the featured image for each property. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to grab an image element. I'll add this into my group. And what I'd like to do is reference the featured image of the property that belongs to each repeating group cell. Now, one thing I should also just point out is that our image here doesn't actually sit inside of our repeating group. Our image sits inside of a group that then also sits inside of a repeating group. And so in order to reference the data of a property from our repeating group, we're going to need to pass some data through to our white group, which is then going to pass that data through to the image that sits inside of it. So it's almost like one of those Russian dolls where you just continually pull out layers. And so if I was to select on my white group, which is just a little bit confusing to see right now on our page. So what I might do is just give this a flat background color and set this to be a light shade of red, so we can actually see where it sits on our page for the time being. Now, when you go to preview or publish your app, of course, you can just remove this color and then it'll look beautiful once again. But when I'm working inside a Bubble, what I like to do is color code all of my groups. And that way it just feels like I'm building with a bunch of different Lego blocks, which is just visually easier to follow. So if I leave this as a red group for the time being, what you'll notice is with groups, they have the ability to store data inside of them. And as I mentioned, I'm going to want to pass the data on from each house or property into this red group. So then I can reference it within my image element that sits inside of that red group. So for the type of content I want to store inside of this red group, I'm going to have this be the property. And for the data source, I'm going to have this pull the information from the current cell's property. Now, the current cell's property just refers to the property displayed in each cell of our repeating group. So if I was to jump into Zillow here, this cell here would be property number 1. So it would be cell number 1. This would be cell number 2, cell number 3, and so on. And so right now, our white group is just storing the information of each individual property. So that way we can then pass it on to all of the elements we're going to display inside of that group. And so if we just jump back into Bubble here, if I was to now select on my image element, which sits inside of my red group, the first thing I'm going to do is give this a dynamic image data source. And once again, by the word dynamic, this just means that it's always going to change to display the relevant information of whatever property needs to be displayed. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's property. Now the parent group is the red group that this image sits within. And the reason why it's called a parent group is because our red group is kind of taking care of all of the elements that sit inside of it. So it's known as the parent. And of course, the red group is pulling data from our repeating group. And so that just means that it's going to pull all of the relevant information from the applicable property at the time. And from that property, I'd like to display the featured image. Now, a personal preference of mine, and I know I probably confused the hell out of you out of this point, but this is just something that's going to make your application look much more visually enticing, is that whenever I work with dynamic images, I also like to select this More option. And if I choose to process an image with ImageX, I'm just going to tick this option here, which just resizes and fits the dimensions of an image by cropping it. So that just means that if an image doesn't quite fit the space that we allocated, Bubble's just going to zoom into it and crop it nicely. So that way it fits all of the space and it just creates a much better end user experience. Now, by all means, this isn't completely necessary. This is just a personal preference of mine. But I really do think that if you take the time to do this, it will create a much nicer experience for your end users. I'll then choose to just close this here. So at this point in time, we now have a data source for our image. The only other thing we'll need to do is update the design of it as well as the responsive settings for it. So in our appearance tab, I'm just going to scroll on down and remove the default style of this image. Now, while I'm working on this image, I'm just going to add a solid border around this. So that way, if I was to click away, I can actually see where it sits inside of my red group. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can choose to remove this border. So that way it's not as visible later on. But for the time being, that's all I'm going to do. I'd also like to update the roundness of its borders to be slightly curved, because if we were to look at the real world Zillow clone here, you can see that the top borders are curved to match the white group that they sit within. However, the bottom borders are not curved here. They have pointy edges. And so in order to replicate that experience, we can tick this option to define each border independently. And then if I just set the top left border to be 5 and the top right border to be 5, it's just going to curve the edges of the top borders only, which is the exact experience we wanted to create. Now that's all I'd like to change within my design tab. What we're going to do is jump over to our layout tab and we're going to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this image is going to take up as little or as much space as it can within my red group. When it comes to the height of this group, however, I'm not going to manually update the minimum height here. Instead, I'm going to use this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I set this to be a 3:2 ratio, what you'll just see is that that's going to make this more like a rectangle. And so that just means that if this image increases in size or decreases in size, it will always remain a perfect rectangle because the aspect ratio is fixed at this particular ratio here. Now, in order to get this ratio, I honestly just experimented around. I think I started with something like a 2:1 ratio, but I just found that that was a little too narrow. Although, to be honest, that probably could work. But I think I just settled on a 3:2 ratio just because I liked this particular size here. But again, there's no scientific reason why I selected this ratio. I truly just played around with it. Now, I'm not going to add in any margins for this image here, but below this image, I'd now like to display the price of this property. So if we head up to our visual elements, I'm going to add a text element into my red group, and it's going to sit below my image. Then when it comes to this text element, I'd just like to display the total price of the property. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference once again the parent group's property. And if I scroll on down, I'm going to select the sell price. Now, because in our database, we're storing the sell price as a number, I'm going to select this More option and choose to format this here as a currency, which now means that I can add a currency prefix. So I'm going to set mine to be dollars. And I'm also just going to select to add a 1000 separator, which is just going to create a much cleaner experience. I'll then choose to close this here. And if I was to scroll on down, I'm just going to update the design of this text element. I'm going to set the font size to be 18. I'll choose to bold this text. And now we can update the responsive settings of this. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to sound like a broken record here because what I'm going to do is unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. So now it's going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can. Now, when it comes to the minimum height, whenever I work with text elements, I do set this to be 0 just to ensure that the actual text element will collapse around the text inside of it there. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that will just ensure it doesn't touch any of the elements that sit around it. Now, while we've added this text element in, so as you can see on our data source, this is going to display the sell price of this property. But what happens if a property being displayed is not a house that's for sale? What happens if it's a rental? Instead of displaying the sell price, what we'll need to do is display the monthly rental price. And so in order to create that experience, we're going to need to leverage yet another powerful feature inside of Bubble, and that feature is known as conditions. So within our property editor here, you'll see this tab known as the conditional tab. Now, conditions are essentially a way to create some sort of rule whenever a behavior is met inside of Bubble. Now, if you're new to Bubble, I expect everything I just said to be complete gibberish to you. So what I'm going to do is explain this in a real example. At this point in time, this text element is displaying the sell price of a property. But as I said, what I'd like to do is first of all, identify if a property is a rental, not a house for sale. So with the condition, what we can do is define a condition and just recognize when the parent group's property, when the listing type is in fact a rental, not a sale property. What I'd like to do is update the text that's displayed here. And instead of referencing the sell price data field, I'd like to reference the monthly rental price data field. So what we can do is then update the text that's displayed, and we can completely just swap this out with a separate value. So now instead of displaying the sell price, I'm going to reference the parent group's property, its monthly rental price. And because this is once again a number, I'm going to select the more option, and I'll format this as a currency. I'll add our 1000 separator, and I'll set my currency here to be dollars. That is perfect. And so now this is automatically going to update and display a rental price whenever a property is in fact a rental. Below this text element, I'd like to add in yet another, which if we look at the real world Zillow product here, this just displays the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, as well as the square footage of this property. So in order to do that, I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll grab a text element. I'll add it into my red group. If I wanted to move this below my existing text element, I could just jump to my layout tab and move this to the next position here. Then from here, if I jump to my appearance tab, what I'm going to do is add in a combination of dynamic and static text. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I'd like to, first of all, display the total count of how many bedrooms a property has, I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's property, its bedroom count. Now that's just going to give me a number. So if a property has 3 bedrooms, it's just going to display the number 3. So what I'll then need to do is add a space, type in the letters BDS. So that's just the abbreviation for beds. I'll add another space, and then I'm going to add a straight line here, followed by yet another space. And now from here, I'd like to display the number of bathrooms. So I'm going to insert dynamic data once again, and I'm going to reference the parent group's property, and in this case, the bathroom count. Then from here, I'm going to select in this input field once again. I'm going to type in the abbreviation BA for bathrooms. I'll add a space, a straight line, followed by another space. And then finally, I'd like to display the square footage of this property. So once again, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's property. And if I just scroll on down, we can reference the square footage. And now because this is a number, and it might be quite long, it might be in the thousands or 10,000s, what I'm going to do is select the more option and choose to format this as a number, which it already is. But the reason I'm doing this is because I just like to add my 1000 separator in there. So that way it just formats this nicely. I'll then choose to close this. I will select into my input field. I'll add a space, and I'll just type in the abbreviation for square footage, so SQFT. And thankfully that is all of the text we'll need to add into this text field. Now I'm quite happy to leave the design of this text as the default settings. However, we will just need to update the responsive settings of this text. So if we jump over to our layout tab here, we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Of course, we're going to set the minimum width to be 0. We'll leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this text element can take up as little or as much space as it needs. When it comes to the height, I'm also going to update the minimum height here to be 0. And the reason I'm doing that is because we have this option selected here to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. So that just means it's going to collapse nicely around that text. And then finally, I'd also like to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this text element. So that way it doesn't touch any of the additional elements that sit around it there. Now, below this text element that displays the details of the property, I'd just like to display the actual address of this property. And so in order to do that, I'm going to head over to my visual elements. I'll grab yet another text element, add this into my red group. And when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's property, its address. It's as simple as that. For the design of this text, I'm just going to scroll on down and update the font size to be 16. So that way it's slightly larger. I'll then jump into my layout tab and make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, of course. Then for the minimum height, I'm also going to set that to be 0. And you'll see that it will now collapse nicely around the text element. And then finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And I can actually just see that I've accidentally added 10 pixels of margin at the bottom of our text element that sits above this. I apologize, I didn't want to do that, sorry. I just want to leave that one as 0. But after updating this, there is one very last field I'd like to add into our entire card here. And that is going to be the name of the agent who has listed this property. And so we're going to head up to our visual elements. We'll grab a text element, add this into our red group. Now I'd like to move this text element to the very last position in my red group. So if we jump to our layout tab, I can move this to the next position. Then when it comes to our appearance tab here, I'm going to start by typing in some static text. And I'm just going to type in the words listed by semicolon. And I'm going to keep that in all caps. I'm then going to add a space, and I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data. And in this case, as the name would suggest, I'd like to display the name of the agent who has listed this property. So I'm going to reference the parent group's property. And if I scroll on down, you'll see the option to reference the person who created this property. So every single time a user creates something in your database, Bubble is automatically going to attach that to the user who in fact created that. And so that's going to be known as the creator field. So if I select on this, I can now reference who the person was that created this property. And because that person is a user, which is linked to our user data type, you'll see that I have the ability to reference all of the data fields within that data type. And in this case, I'm going to reference the agency name. Now, because I'd like to format this in all caps, I'm going to select the More option, and I'm just going to choose to make all of the letters here in uppercase. And that is all I'll need to change for the data source of this text. I would just like to scroll on down to my design settings here and update the font size to be 12. So I'm going to make this text quite small. That's all I'll need to change for my design though. So if I jump into my layout tab, once again, we'll need to make this element fully responsive. So as you probably guessed, that means we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. We'll update the minimum height to also be 0, so that way it collapses nicely around all of that text. And because this is in fact the very last element I'd like to add into our group here, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border. So that also includes the bottom. Now, as I mentioned, this was the very last element I wanted to display inside of our red group. So I can now select on my red group, jump to my layout tab, and it's at this point that I can now update the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this option selected by default to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it will just collapse nicely around all of the details of our property. And now once we've finished configuring our red group, we can now select on the overall repeating group. So this is our repeating group property. We can head to our layout tab and we can now update its minimum height to also be 0, which means that when it collapses to fit the height of the element around the content inside of it, it's going to fit nicely around our red group. I'd also just like to add in some margins around this repeating group. And for these margins, I'm not going to add any at the top. However, I'd like to add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom and 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that our repeating group won't directly touch the borders of my page. And now the very last thing we'll need to do to configure this repeating group is jump over to our appearance tab. And what we can actually do is now update the minimum height of each row to also be 0. Now what this means is that, similar to before, it's just going to collapse the height down and make sure it fits nicely around all of our elements. And you remember before how I explained that when it came to these settings here, you'd need to just kind of experiment with what's going to work. Today, when it came to the number we'd added in, it actually worked out to be perfect. And the reason for that is because right now, the minimum width of each column for our repeating group is 300 pixels. So by each column, that just means each repeating group cell that you see here. So each one of these will have a minimum width of 300 pixels, meaning they will not be able to shrink below 300 pixels in width. Now, the reason why that's perfect is because if I was to open up my responsive tab here, what you'll see is that we have the ability to expand the width of our page out. And as you'll see, Bubble will continually add in more cells into our repeating group. However, as we shrink the page, Bubble will remove repeating group cells and it'll just stack them down our page. But the reason why 300 pixels is perfect is because if you were to look at this on a mobile device, at the smallest possible size on a mobile device, your application is going to be 320 pixels in width. Now, I personally find that most modern mobile devices, so things like an iPhone 14, usually have a width of about 380 pixels, if not larger. But if you've got someone using your application that still lives in the Stone Age and they have something like an iPhone 5, the smallest possible screen size that they will have is 320 pixels here. So that's kind of like the absolute bare minimum you need to design for when it comes to creating a responsive experience in Bubble. And the reason why I said the 300 pixel minimum width on our repeating group is perfect is because, as I mentioned, the absolute minimum width of each column is 300 pixels, but we also just need to factor in the 10 pixels of margin we have on each side of our repeating group. So 300 plus 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 pixels of margin on the right is 320 pixels. So that now creates a fully responsive experience on any mobile device size. So on anything as small as an iPhone 5, all the way up to something like an iPhone 14, as well as all the way up to a full desktop browser. And now that is how you can create a fully responsive experience on our homepage. Now, I know at this point in time, it doesn't look like we've created much on our homepage, but as you can see, it took quite a bit of time to run through all of the finer details throughout the process. And if you were to run a preview of this page now, you wouldn't actually see anything on it aside from your hero section. The reason for that is because at this point in time, we actually haven't created any properties in our database. So we don't have any properties to display within our repeating group. But of course, later on when we build that feature out, you'll be able to see a nice list of all of the properties that are based near you. For the time being though, what we're going to do is jump back into our Notion checklist. And we're going to tick off that we've finished building out the homepage, which included building out the base of our search feature. So I explained how we just needed to add in that custom search field, as well as configure our own Google Maps API keys. And then from there, we took the time to build out the repeating group that's going to display a list of properties based near the current user. Now that we've finished building out the crux of our homepage, I just wanted to move along to one of the next core features that's related to that specific page. And that's going to be building out a navigation menu, which of course will allow users to jump between all of the different pages we're going to create in our app today. So if I was to just quickly open up the real world Zillow product, you'll see at the top of the page, we have this white navigation menu. And inside of this, we have a Zillow logo, as well as a bunch of different text elements, which when clicked will send someone through to that relevant page. Now, contrary to what you might think, there is quite a few little nuances involved within building a navigation event. And it's more just around creating a responsive experience. Because if I was to just look at this navigation event, it is just a series of text elements and a logo in the middle. But when things get complex is when you actually reduce the width of your browser, or if you view this on a mobile device. So as you'll see, once the browser becomes below a certain width, the text options in our header menu disappear, and we now have this little drop-down menu, which will display all of these same menu items whenever you click this little hamburger icon. And so today we're going to actually be building out that entire experience within Bubble. And I'm going to break this down into two separate modules once again. And so in our first section here, we're actually going to build out the design of the navigation menu you see. And we will make that fully responsive. But then in the second section, we're going to build out that mobile drop-down menu. So that way when the menu collapses itself, your users will still be able to navigate between all of these separate pages in your app. Now, if we jump over into Bubble, when it comes to the process of creating a header navigation menu, as you just saw, you essentially just add a group element to the top of your page. And because you'd like to display a series of elements horizontally across your page, you would set that element's container layout to be a row. Then from there, you can add in all of your text elements and even your Zillow logo. Now, although we could do that on our homepage here, what I'm actually going to do is instead create something known as a reusable element in Bubble. And the reason I'm going to do this is because our navigation menu is not just going to be displayed on our homepage. We're going to want the exact same menu to be displayed across every single page in our app today. And so instead of having to recreate this each individual time on every page of our app, Bubble has this feature known as reusable elements, where it essentially, as the name would suggest, allows you to build an element once and then just reuse it wherever you would like within your app. And in order to build a reusable element, what you'll need to do is open up your page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner. And right at the bottom, you're going to see this option to add a new reusable element. We're going to click on this and we're going to call this our header menu. We'll then choose to create this. And now we'll be sent through to what looks like another page in our app. And this is where we can design our reusable element. So if I was to double click on this, the first thing you'll notice is that our header menu here is a reusable element, which is a group. And when you're building reusable elements, you can create things like pop-ups or floating groups. But today we're going to be using the standard group option. So we won't need to change anything there. What I would just like to do while we're in our appearance tab is just add a solid border around this group. So that way when I click away, I can see where it actually lies within my Bubble editor. And then later on, when I add it onto my actual page, we'll easily be able to distinguish where this element starts and ends. Now, after updating the design of this element, we'll also need to jump into our layout tab because of course, like any group, we're going to need to make this group fully responsive. Now, for the container layout, as I alluded to before, for your navigation menu, you're going to want to display a series of text elements across your page, which means you'll be stacking elements horizontally. So that means that the container layout will need to be a row, not a column. And then once we update our container layout, we'll have access to all of the width and height settings, only they're just going to look a little bit different to the traditional group elements you would build and work with inside a Bubble. One of the good things about a reusable element though is that by default it is fully responsive. So you can see our minimum width here is 0 pixels and our maximum width is infinite. So that means it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can on our page. However, the reason why this group is quite small at the moment is because we have this other width setting known as the width of our UI builder. So this is just the width that's going to be displayed while we're actually building the reusable element. And right now it's set as 200 pixels. What I'm actually going to do is set this to be 960 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 960 is because that is a good format for a desktop device. But just bear in mind, this is just the width of how it's being displayed in your editor. As I mentioned, this group is still fully responsive with these two settings here. Now within this group, we will come back and update the height settings. But before we do that, we're going to need to add in all of the elements I'd like to display inside of it. And the very first element is going to be a group that contains a series of text elements on the left-hand side of my menu. So when I look at the real world Zillow product here, I can personally see that this navigation menu is broken into 3 different sections. We've got our section on the left-hand side, we've got our logo in the middle, and then we have our section on the right-hand side. So if I was looking at this, I would picture that this is one big group on the left-hand side. Then we've got our image in the middle, and then we have another group which contains more text elements on the right-hand side. And so if we were to jump into Bubble, what I'm going to do is scroll on down to my containers menu and add a group inside of my existing white group. Now, the first thing I'll do with this group is actually just update the name of this to be called Group Left, because this is going to be the group that's displayed on the left-hand side of our navigation menu. I'm also going to jump to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to detach the style of this because I'd like to set the background style to be a flat color, and I'm going to select that this should be a light shade of red. Again, this is just a personal preference of mine, but it easily allows me to distinguish where this new group sits inside of my overall reusable element. Now for this group, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to set the container layout to be a row because as you saw before, we're going to be stacking a series of text elements side by side. And then I'm also going to make this group fully responsive. So I will unselect that it should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width as infinite. Now from here, we can add our text elements into this group. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements. I'll grab a text element and I'll add this in. Now for this text element, I'm just going to have this display the word buy. I'll then head on down to my design settings and just update the size of this font to be 20. And I'm not going to make any other changes from there. I will, however, need to update the responsive settings of this. So I'll jump to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. But when it comes to the maximum width, I'm actually going to select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that just means that instead of taking up as much space as it can on our page, it's automatically just going to fit the width to the exact dimensions it needs to display this text element. I'll then do the exact same thing for our height. So if I set the minimum height to be 0, it's also going to collapse around the height there. And that's all I'm going to change here. While we're working on this text element, I would just like to add a margin to the right-hand side of 20 pixels. And the reason for that is because we're about to add yet another text element beside this. If I wanted, I could also choose to vertically align this text element in the center of my red group. And that's just going to allow me to ensure that all of the items I add into our group are going to be perfectly aligned. From here, I'm just going to add another text element in, but to streamline that whole process, I'm just going to make a copy of this existing text element. So I'm using a Mac, so I'm just going to use the Command C shortcut. If you're on Windows, it's Control C. I'll select into my red group, hit Command V, and I'll paste in another text element. Now for this text element, I'd just like to jump over to my Appearance tab and update this to display the word rent. And then finally, I'm going to make one last copy of this, only this time I'm going to update the text to display the word sell. And because this is the very last text element I'd like to add into this red group here, what I'm going to do is jump over to my layout tab and just remove that right margin. And that's just going to ensure that when we collapse this red group, it'll fit nicely around all of our elements. So from here, I can select on the overall red group. I can jump to my layout tab. And the first thing I'll do is update the height of this group. I'm going to set this to be 0. And what you'll see is that it will now collapse nicely around all of the text elements. When it comes to the width, I'm also going to once again select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And once again, it's going to collapse nicely around all of our text elements. We can then choose to vertically align our overall red group into the center of our white group. And then finally, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this red group. And the reason for that is because when I close off all of the empty space for my overall white reusable element group, I don't want the borders to touch my red group. So this will just ensure that there still is some space, but at least now I can control how much there is. Now, beside this group, I'd like to add my Zillow logo. So in order to do that, I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll add an image into my white group. And when it comes to this image, I'm going to upload a static image from my local device here. Now, of course, you can also access the same logo through the Google Drive link that I provided before. But when it comes to this image, we'll just need to jump to our layout tab and obviously update the formatting of this. For this image, I'm going to set the width of this to be 200 pixels. And I am going to keep this as a fixed width. I don't want this image to continually scale up or down based on the size of our page. I'm always going to want it to be the exact same size. And that size is going to be 200 pixels. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And that aspect ratio is going to be 4:1. So this is just the aspect ratio that's going to work nicely with this logo. While we're here, I'll also vertically align this image in the center of my white group. And then finally, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border, just like we've done with our red group. And now after configuring our image, I'd like to add yet another group into our overall reusable element. And that's going to be the group that displays on the right-hand side. So I'm going to head on down to my containers menu, add a group into my existing group. And I'm first of all going to update the name of this to be called group right. Now, before I make any changes to this group, I'd just like to jump to my appearance tab, detach the style of this, and set the background style to once again be a flat color. So that way I can set the color to be, let's say, a light shade of green. And now I can easily see where this sits on my page. I'll also jump over to my layout tab. I'll update the container layout to be a row because I'll still be stacking text elements in this across our page, so horizontally. I can then unselect that this element should be a fixed width. I will update the minimum width to be 0, and for the time being, we'll leave the maximum width as infinite. And now within this group, I just want to add 2 elements. There's one text element, which is going to allow someone to manage their listings when it's clicked, and the other is just going to display the profile photo of a user, and when that's clicked, it's going to send them through to their settings page. And so in order to add the text element, I'm actually just going to select on one of our existing text elements here. I'll select our by text element. I'll make a copy of that. I'll select into our green group and paste a version of that in. And because I've copied this across, it's copied all of the formatting and styling, so we don't need to change anything there. The only thing we'll need to update is in our appearance tab, and that's going to be the actual text that we want to display. So this is just going to display the words manage listing. And I should actually add an S on that because a user could manage multiple listings, not just one. Now, beside this text element, I'd like to display the user's profile photo. So if I scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to grab an image element. I'll add this in. And when it comes to the data source of this image, I'm going to want to display a dynamic image. So this will be the image that a user has uploaded as their profile photo. But what you'll also need to remember is that if we were to open up our database, under our user data type, we'd already taken the time to upload a default image for the user's profile photo. So as soon as a user registers an account, by default, we do have an image to actually display. So if we jump into our design tab, what I'm going to do is head to our dynamic image. I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the current user. So the current user is the person who is logged in viewing our application, and I'd like to display their profile photo. Now, when it comes to working with dynamic images, I always like to select this more option, so that way I can choose to process these images with Injix, and this will give me the option to select and resize and fit the dimensions by cropping it, just so that way if an image is quite small and it doesn't take up all the space, it will just expand it out and make it larger. I'm then going to choose to close this here, and we can now update the design settings for this image. I'm going to scroll on down and choose to detach the style of this image. And for the time being, I'm just going to add a solid border around this. So that way when I click away, I can actually see where this image sits on my page. I'll select back on my image though, because I'd also like to update the roundness of its borders to be 100. Now that's going to help us make this a perfect circle. From here, we can then jump to our layout tab, because of course we'll need to update the size of this image. And when it comes to this image, I'd like to set the width of this to be 40 pixels. Now I am going to keep this as a fixed width because I'm only ever going to want this image to be 40 pixels, no larger and no smaller. I'll also select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I leave this at a 1:1 ratio, it's going to make it 40 pixels by 40 pixels, which now makes it a perfect circle. We can then choose to vertically align this in the center of my green group. And that is all of the elements I'll actually need to add into this green group. So I'm going to select on this group here, head to my layout tab, and we can now close off all of this empty space. So we're going to update the minimum height here to be 0. And what that's going to do is collapse nicely around all of the elements that sit inside of it. I'm then going to need to do the exact same thing for my width. So I'm going to select to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And once again, it's going to fit nicely around our elements. I will vertically align this in the center of my white group. And finally, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this group. Now, at this point in time, if I was to just close my property editor here, what you'll notice is that all of my elements are currently positioned to the left-hand side of my overall white group. Whereas what we'd like to do if we were cloning the real-world Zillow product is have one of our groups on the left, the image in the middle, and then our right-hand group to the right-hand side. So how can we replicate that? If we jump into Bubble and select on our overall white reusable element, and if we head to our layout tab, of course, at this point in time, we've set the container layout to be a row, which means we're going to horizontally stack elements across our page. But as you can see, the container alignment here is positioned to the left. So the container alignment just determines in which way elements are going to be positioned inside of your group. So if I was to, let's say, center this, you'll see all of our elements will be positioned smack bang in the center of our white group. But what I'm interested in selecting from today is this option here known as the space between. And what this is going to do is add an even amount of space between each element inside of this group. So it's going to replicate this exact experience we want here. Now at this point in time, we're not quite done with all of the groups we need to add into our main navigation menu. So what I should point out right now is that, of course, in our right-hand group, we're displaying a user's profile photo. But what happens if a user actually doesn't have an account? What happens if they just visit our Zillow clone and it's the first time they've landed on our application? We obviously wouldn't have a profile photo to display because that person actually hasn't signed up for our app. And that leads me to my next point, is how can we actually get people to sign up for our app? And so if I was to just quickly jump over into Zillow, I'm logged in at the moment when I'm viewing this app. But if I was to just grab this URL here, make a copy of it, then open up an incognito browser and paste in that URL, what you'll see is that we now have the option to sign in or sign up to this application. And so that's something I'd like to replicate within our own Zillow clone today. So if we were to jump back into Bubble, what I'm actually going to do is add yet another group to the right-hand side here. And within that group, I'm going to display that to users when they're logged out. And then I'm going to select to only display this green group to users when they're logged in. So in order to do this, I'm going to grab another group and add this into my existing white group here. Now I'm going to jump to my appearance tab. And for this group, the first thing I'll do is just attach the style of this. So that way I can give it a flat background color. I'll set this to be something like a light shade of, let's say, purple. It doesn't really matter. I just want to be able to see where this sits on my page. I'll then jump to my layout tab and I'll update its container layout to once again be a row because I want to stack elements horizontally within this. For the width settings, I'm going to make this fully responsive for the time being. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Now, of course, we will come back again and update these settings in a moment. But before I do that, I'm just going to add in 2 text elements. One's going to display the word sign in, and the other's going to display the word sign up. And then later on in our application, I'm going to run you through the process of how we can actually register a user's account and also create an experience that allows them to log into an existing account. So what I'm going to do is select on any text element here. Let's just say I'm going to select on my buy text. I'll make a copy of that, select into my purple group and paste a version of that in. Now, once again, all of the formatting has copied across. The only thing I'll need to change here is within my appearance tab. And I'm first of all just going to display the words sign in. Then from here, I'm going to make a copy of this text element and I'm just going to change this to now display the words sign up. And I'll just need to remove this margin on the right-hand side of this text element because this is the very last element we're going to add into our purple group. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to head down to my right margin and I'm just going to set that to be 0. And because that is the very last element I'd like to add into this purple group, I'll select on the overall group itself, head to my layout tab, and I'm going to update the minimum height here to be 0. So that way, once again, it collapses around our text. I'll then need to do the same thing for our width. I'm going to select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And of course, once again, it has collapsed nicely around the width of our elements. I will then vertically align this in the center of our white group. And of course, add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border. Now, another thing I should point out is that I'd like to be able to distinguish between our 2 groups on the right-hand side here. So I'll need to update the name of this group to be called group right logged out, because this is the group I'd like to display to users when they're actually logged out of our app. Whereas the green group is going to be the group that's going to be displayed to users when they're logged in. So I could select on this and update the name of this to be called group right logged in. And now it's at this point that I'd just like to highlight how we can actually hide and display one of these groups to the relevant user at the relevant point in time. So let's say if you're brand new to my application, you open up the homepage, you shouldn't see this green group. You should only see this purple group because that's going to prompt you to either sign into your account or sign up for a new account. And so what I'm going to do is double click on my green group and open up our property editor. I'm then going to head to my layout tab and I'm actually going to unselect this option that makes this element visible on page load. So that just means that by default, this element will be hidden. I'm also going to choose to select this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. Because as you can see, although this element isn't being displayed, it's still taking up the same amount of space on our page. Or I should say in our group. So what I'm going to do is select this option to collapse when hidden. And now that means it's not going to take up any space at all and our purple group will move over and take its place. However, I am going to need to create a condition on this group that's just going to recognize when the current user is in fact logged in. I'd like to display this group, not the purple one. So I'm going to define a condition here, and I'm just going to recognize when the current user is logged in. I'd like to then select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And what I love about Bubble is that you can choose to toggle these conditions on and off. So if I wanted to see what this condition looks like when it is true, you'll obviously see that this element is now visible again. Now from here, I'm going to need to do the exact same thing for my purple group. Only in this instance, I'd like to display this whenever a user is logged out. So the first thing I'll do is select on the group, head to my layout tab and unselect that this should be visible on page load. I'm then going to select to collapse this element when it's hidden. And if I jump over to my conditional tab, I'm going to define a condition and I'm going to recognize when the current user is in fact logged out. I'd like to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And of course, I can choose to toggle this on and off. So that way I can see what this is going to look like when that behavior is met. And now that is how we can start to create a truly dynamic experience for any user of our app. Another thing I should point out is that at this point in time, we have a series of text elements that aren't going to be relevant to every single user. So let's say if someone signs up for our application and they're only interested in buying or renting homes. In that case, we shouldn't actually display this option that allows them to sell a house, or even this option that allows them to view all of their property listings. And so what I'd like to do is create yet another condition on each of these individual text elements that just recognizes that they should only be displayed once a user has upgraded their account to become a buyer. Because if you remember in our database, if I was to head to my user data type, we have a data field known as the profile type, which is linked to our option set list. And that option set list just had two options. You could either be a buyer or you could be a seller. And by default, we've set that everyone is a buyer. So not everyone is automatically going to be able to sell properties. Later on throughout our tutorial, I'm going to explain how users can actually upgrade to become sellers. But by default, everyone is a buyer. So they actually shouldn't see these two options. And so what we're going to do is select on our cell text here. I'm going to double click on this. I'll do the exact same thing as our groups. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab. And I'm first of all going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. Then I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any space there. I'll then jump over to my conditional tab. I'll define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user, when their profile type is in fact a seller, not a buyer. This element should be visible and I will tick that that should be true. And if I wanted to toggle this on, I can see what this is going to look like when this condition is met. And now from here, I'm going to need to do the exact same thing for our manage listings text, because I'd only like to display this to someone who is a seller, not a buyer. So I'm going to head to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be visible on page load. I will select to collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab. I'll define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user, when their profile type is in fact a seller. I will select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And I'll just toggle this on for the time being. So that way I get a good idea of where this element's going to sit on my reusable element. And now after adding in all of those conditions, we can start to actually make our header navigation menu functional. And then once we've done that, we can close off all of this empty space and make it fully responsive. And so what I mean by making this navigation menu functional is actually creating the workflows that are going to run whenever someone clicks on one of these options. Because if someone wants to click on, let's say, the buy option, we'll want to send them through to a search results page. If someone clicks on the sell option, we'll send them through to a page where they can create a new property listing. And we're going to do that for almost every element here. And so I'm actually going to start with the sell text here. And the reason for that is because our buy and rent text are going to have a little bit more involved within the workflows, but I don't want to confuse you right out of the gate. So what I want to do is just show you how simple it is to build out a workflow that sends someone through to a new page in our app. So I'm going to double click on this cell text and I'm going to choose to add a workflow here. And within this workflow, this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble come to life. So this is where we can visually create the logic within our application. So essentially what you're doing here is visually coding, and it is a super straightforward process. So within this workflow, it's going to be pretty basic. All we're going to do is send someone through to a new page within our app, and that is the page where they can create a new property listing because they'll want to sell a property. So within my workflow, I'm going to add an action here, and we're going to select from the navigation events and choose the go to page trigger. Now from this point, you'll need to select a destination page. And at this point in time, our page does not yet exist. because we have not yet created it. So we're going to create a brand new page from scratch, and this page will be called our listing page. I'm going to choose to create this. Then from our destination dropdown, I can select that will send someone through to that listing page. It truly is as simple as that. Now at this point in time, I should also just point out that we won't need to send any data through to this page, but we will be doing that later on throughout our tutorial. But for the time being, this is all we'll need to add to this particular workflow. Now, when I'm building out workflows, I also like to personally color code these, so that way I can easily identify what features in my app they belong to. So if I select on my workflow trigger here, I'm going to head to my event color and set this to be red. Now throughout today in my tutorial, I'm going to set all of my navigation events to be red. So that way on any page when I open up my workflow editor, I know that all my red workflows send people to different pages in my app. We can then jump back into our design tab, and we're going to build out the workflow that runs when someone clicks on the manage listings text. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow here when this is clicked, and similar to before, what I'm going to do is select a navigation event, choose the go to page action, and I'll set the destination page here to be a brand new page that we need to create. So I'm going to head on down and select to create a new page, and we're going to call this page the manage page. So on that page, we're going to display a list of all of the properties that someone has created. And then from there, they'll be able to manage them. So they can choose to change the details of them and anything else that's relevant to that property. I'm just going to choose to create this for now though. And I'm going to set that as our destination page. So I'll select our manage page. We can then jump to our workflow trigger once again and select that the event color here should be red because this is also a navigation event. Now what you'll also see is as we're creating these pages, these will now be displayed within your page drop-down menu. And of course, at this point in time, all these pages should be blank because we've only given them a name. We haven't actually made any changes to them. If we were to jump into our design tab once again, I'd like to select on my user's profile photo. And in this case, I'd like to send someone through to a settings page when this is clicked, because this is the page where a user could update any additional settings within their profile. So we're going to choose to add a workflow here. We're going to once again select from a navigation event, choose the go to page action, and we'll need to create a brand new page. So I'm going to open up my page drop-down menu, select to create a page, and I will call this the settings page. I'll choose to create this. Then from my drop-down menu, I can open this once again and select that my destination page should in fact be that settings page, and I won't need to send any data through to this, so I can leave that field blank. We'll then select on our workflow trigger. We can update our event color here to be red. And if we were to jump back into our design tab, that covers almost all of our text elements. Now for the sign up and the sign in text elements, we're not going to build any workflows out right now in this section of our tutorial. Instead, in a future module, I'm going to explain how we can actually display a pop-up on our page whenever someone clicks on either of these options. And in that pop-up, they'll be able to either sign in or sign up to an account. So we don't need to create any navigation events for these right now. What I could do though is select on my Zillow logo and create a workflow that will send someone back to our home page. So if I double click on this logo, I'll choose to add a workflow. And whenever this image is clicked, I'm going to once again select from a navigation event. I'll choose the go to page action. And in this case, our destination page does already exist. So our home page is our index page because that is the standard page that comes by default in any bubble application. We'll then select on our workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. And now finally, we can build out the two workflows that are going to run when the buy and the rent text are clicked. Now, the reason why I left these till last is because we're going to need to send some information through to our destination page whenever one of these options is clicked. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But let's click on our buy text for the time being and choose to start a workflow whenever someone selects this option in our menu. Now, within this workflow, we're once again going to select from a navigation event and choose the go to page action. And at this point in time, the destination page does not yet exist. So we will need to create this. And when it comes to this page, we're going to be calling this the search results page. So I'll select to create this here. Then I will select that that should be the destination page for this workflow. But if I was to just take a moment and pause right here and then head over to the real world Zillow application and click on this buy button here, what you'll see is that we've been sent through to our search results page, which just displays a list of properties as well as a map. And we've got these additional filters here. But what you'll see is that when we were sent through to this page, we're now only being displayed properties that are for sale, not properties that are for rent. And so this is the experience I wanted to create today. When someone clicks on the buy text, I want to send someone through to the search results page and allow them to look at homes for purchase. Whereas when someone clicks on the rent text, I'll send them through to the same page, but I would only like to display properties that are available to rent. And so in order to do that, we're going to jump back into our bubble editor. And within this workflow where we've sent someone through to our search results page, I'm going to need to send through some information about whether someone would like to either buy or rent a property. And in this case, that user would like to look at properties that are available for sale. And the way in which we can do this is by using a tool known as page parameters. So if we were to select this option here to send page parameters to our destination page, it's going to allow us to send through multiple bits of information. And in this case, I'd like to send through the fact that someone's going to want to buy a property, so they'll only look at properties that are for sale. And then I'd also like to send through their current location. So that way we can display a list of properties that are near their current suburb. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, you might not be familiar with page parameters, but as a user of the internet, I can guarantee that you have come across page parameters at some point in time. In fact, right now, if you were to look at the URL in your Bubble editor, you'll see a whole series of page parameters. So if I was to open up my URL here, I can see that I'm currently looking at bubble.io, and then I have this page string here, which is called my page. But beside that, I have this little question mark, and then you have all of these random bits of text and characters, and these are known as your URL parameters, or page parameters for that matter. So within this URL parameter, Bubble's storing a whole bunch of different information. So for instance, you can see that there's a URL parameter here, which is called the ID of my application. And beside that, after the equals value, it actually has the name of your application stored within it. And so then Bubble knows within its editor to display that application. I can also see that there's another URL parameter which just determines what tab I have opened within my editor. And so I can see here that because I have my workflow tab open, this is my tab 2. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the list goes on. And so that's why I can see that under my tab parameter, Bubble knows that I currently have tab 2 open. Now, if I was to delete tab 2 and add in tab 3, then refresh the page, what you'll see is that it's going to reload my Bubble editor here, and it's going to open up tab 3. So this is where page parameters come into play. They allow you to store information within a URL, and then from there you can have your application react to that in real time. So if I just open up my workflow editor once again, you'll see that my parameter will update. But I'm going to open up my workflow that we just created when the buy text was clicked. And as I mentioned, I'd like to send through 2 page parameters. And I'm going to be sure to explain this in a lot of detail as we walk through it. So if I select to add a parameter, the first thing you'll need to do is give this parameter a name. And the technical term for this is known as the key, but let's forget that. Let's just call it a name. Now the name I'd like to give this parameter is going to be called listing type. And something I just want to point out is that you may have noticed that I've formatted this in all lowercase letters. And the reason for that is because later on in our course, when we build out our search results page, we're not going to do it right now, so you don't need to worry, but we're going to need to reference the exact same value we send through in our page parameter from our navigation menu. And in order to reference that parameter, we're going to have to type it in once again. And if we were to, let's say on our search results page, type in the words listing type, but add a capital L, because there isn't a capital L in our parameter name that we've originally created here, there wouldn't actually be an exact match, meaning those 2 parameters wouldn't be able to communicate and send data through to each other. And so that's why I just like to create a standardized way of naming my parameters. So I have a rule where I only use lowercase letters. And another thing I should point out is that I don't use spaces. So you'll see between these 2 words, I added a dash. And the reason for that is because whenever you're working with a URL, if you were to add a space in it, it would just completely break that URL. That's why you'll only ever see dashes or underscores within URLs, and they're just used to replace spaces. Now, for this parameter here, we're sending through a listing type, and this listing type should be properties that are for sale. And so, of course, what I can do is reference the different listing types within my option set list that we've already pre-created. So if I just quickly sidestep over into my data tab here and open up my option sets menu, you'll remember that we've created an option set known as the listing type. And inside of this, we had 2 options. There was the properties that were listed for sale, and there was the properties that were listed as rentals. Now, if I want to reference one of these options, in this case, it will be the properties for sale. What I can do is jump into my workflow editor, and for the value of this parameter, so this is the value you see after the little equals symbol in the URL of your current browser. What we're going to do is select to get an option. So this is going to fetch data from any option set we want in our database. And that option is going to be our listing type. And the option we'll reference is of course going to be the sale option. I can choose to close this, but because in a URL you can only display text or numbers, I'm just going to need to reference the display text of this option set. And if you remember, the display text was the actual name of the option. So in this case, it's just the word sale. So if I was to now click on this, someone would be sent through to our search results page, and in our URL, you would see the word sale, because then our editor would know that it would only need to display properties that are for sale. Now, the other parameter I'd like to add is just going to allow us to determine the location of a user that they would like to search for properties in. Now, on our homepage, if you remember, similar to the real world Zillow product, we added a custom search experience. So this allows someone to type in a particular location that they want to search for. But if someone was to just come up and select this by text, what I'm actually going to want to do is send them through to a search results page and just automatically display properties within their own neighborhood. And so what we're going to do is jump over into Bubble. We're going to add another parameter, and we're going to call this parameter the location. Then from here, when it comes to the actual location we'll send through, this is fairly straightforward. We'll just scroll on down to the bottom, and you'll see the option to reference the current geographic position of the user. So this is their current location based on their browser settings. And in this case, I'm going to select the More option, and I'm going to actually choose to extract a value from this geographic address, and I'm going to pull through the city that they live within. Now, if you wanted, you could pull things like their neighborhood, their state, or even their country. But in this case, I'm going to pull the city. Now, if someone doesn't live in a city, it will in fact pull their suburb. So I'm just going to leave that as is for now and choose to close this. And what you'll now see is that we're now sending through two parameters within our workflow here. Now, again, I know that if you're brand new to Bubble, this is a lot to take in, but I just wanted to explain this now so that way when we build out our search results page, it's a little easier for you to understand how I'm actually going to pull this data from our URL. Now from here, I'm going to select on my workflow trigger and update the event color to be red because this is a navigation event. And now finally, there is just one very last workflow we'll need to create. So if we jump back into our design tab, I'm going to click on this rent text. And instead of actually double clicking on this and choosing to create a brand new workflow from scratch, what we could do is actually just make a duplicate version of the workflow that ran whenever the buy text was clicked. But in that case, we just need to update the value we're sending in our parameter to just notify that we want our app to display rental properties, not properties for sale. So I'm actually just going to contradict what I said and jump back into my workflow editor. I'm going to right click on our workflow that runs whenever the text buy is clicked. I'm going to choose to make a copy of this. I'll then right click here and paste in another version of this workflow. And I'll just need to update the element that's clicked in order to trigger this workflow. And in this case, it's going to be the text rent. So when our menu option is clicked to view rental properties, this workflow will run. And of course, because we've made a duplicate version of our existing workflow, it's already going to send someone through to our search results page. The only thing we'll need to update is the listing type we're sending through here. And so I'm going to choose to delete all of this information here and rebuild this bit from scratch. And in order to do that, you can just right click on this and choose to clear this expression. I'll then select to insert dynamic data once again. I will get an option from my option set list. That list is our listing type. And the option I'll select is the rental option. I can then choose to close this and I'll reference its display text, which is the name of the actual word rental. And from here, I won't need to change anything else for our location parameter. That is all the same. And just like that, that is the very last workflow we'll actually need to build out for our navigation menu. If we just jump back into our design tab, it's at this point that we can now finally update the last few settings for our overall reusable element. So if I was to double click on our white group here, so our group that contains all of the elements, I'm going to head over to my layout tab, and I'm now going to update the minimum height to be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements inside of it. And now before we add this reusable element onto our homepage, what I'd just like to show you is how this is going to function within our responsive tab here. So as you can see, when we're viewing this on a desktop device, everything looks great. So we've got our group on the left, our image in the middle, and our group on the right. And as the page expands, all of the elements will continually expand outwards. But when we start to preview this on a smaller device size, what you'll see is that all of these elements are going to stack on top of each other. And if we were to preview this at 320 pixels, which is the smallest possible mobile device size, you can see that this menu doesn't really look that great, to put it simply. And so how can we create a responsive experience that allows us to replicate the real-world Zillow product? And so once again, I'm just going to jump over into Zillow, and I'm just going to show you what this looks like when I reduce the size of my browser. So you can see that at a certain point in time, all of our menu options disappear here. And then we have this little hamburger menu that's positioned on the left-hand side of our menu, from which when that is clicked, it opens up this vertical menu. And so we're going to replicate that today. And for the time being in this module, I'm just going to focus on how we can hide all of these existing groups and then display our hamburger menu. So if we just jump back into our UI builder here, what we're going to do is head over to our visual elements here. And I'm just going to add an icon element into my header navigation menu here. Now I'd like to position this at the very front of this group. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to make this the first element in my group there. I'm then going to jump over to my appearance tab. And one thing I noticed is that by default, the icon is actually the exact icon we want. It's this little hamburger menu. What I'd also like to do is just update the name of this. I'm going to call this icon hamburger menu. And the reason why they call this a hamburger menu is because it kind of does look like a hamburger. You got your two buns and then you got your patty in the middle. And so that's why it is called a hamburger menu. If I open up the icon color, I'm just going to update this to be a custom color code I have, which is a darker shade of black. If you'd like this color code, it's 081747. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the dimensions of this icon. So when it comes to the size of this icon, I'm going to set the width to be 40 pixels and I'll also set the height to be 40 pixels. Now I'm going to keep these both as fixed values because I'm only ever going to want this little icon to be this exact size, no larger and no smaller. I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my white group, and I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border here. Now, one thing I should point out is that by default, I actually don't want this icon to be visible on our navigation menu. I only want it to be displayed when our browser becomes a certain width where we can no longer display all of our menu options. So while we're in our layout tab, I'm going to unselect this option to make this element visible on page load. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. And now what we're going to need to determine is within our responsive menu, when we should actually display that icon and remove all of our existing groups that have all of our menu options in them. So if I was to expand our page out here, what I'm going to do is head over to my elements tree, and I'm going to tick this option to only show my hidden elements. So that way I can click on all of my additional text elements here and I can view this full menu. Now for the time being, I'm also going to choose to hide my purple group. I'm only going to display my green group, and the reason for that is because this group is larger than my purple group. So I'm just going to be building for the largest case scenario here, which is going to cover us on all bases. And so in order to hide my purple group, I'm going to head over to my group logged out. I'm going to unselect that, and that will now hide this. Now, if I was to slowly start reducing the width of my page, everything's responsive, it's responsive, and I can see at this point here, so at about 686 pixels, this is where elements start to collapse on top of each other. So this is where things become problematic. So what I could actually do is create a condition on all of my groups, and I could choose to hide these whenever the page is smaller than 690 pixels. And then when all of these groups are hidden, I could choose to display my hamburger icon. And so what I'm going to do is start by selecting on my green group here. Now, if you remember, this green group is not visible by default, so it's hidden when the page is loaded. If I jump over to my conditional tab, we've also created this condition that recognizes that this should only be displayed when the current user is logged in. Whereas what I'd now like to do is select the more option. And I'd like to only display this group when the current user is logged in and when the current page width is larger than that 690 pixel mark. And so in order to reference that, I'm just going to type in the word width. I'm going to recognize when the current page width is in fact greater than 690 pixels, this element should be visible. And now this group will be hidden, so it's not going to take up any additional space in our navigation menu. One thing I should point out though is that if we were to reduce the width of our page right now, you'll still see that this element is visible. And the reason for that is because this condition is currently not true. Because right now within our bubble editor, there's no way to tell if we're logged in or not. But of course, when we go to preview this application in a moment, what you'll see is that if we were logged in, this would become fully responsive. Now we're going to need to replicate the exact same thing on our right group logged out. So I'm going to select to display this within my elements tree here. I'm going to click on the purple group itself, and I'm going to add the same extension onto our existing condition here. So with this, I'm going to select the and option, and I'm going to recognize when the current user is logged out and when the current page width is greater than 690 pixels, this group should in fact be displayed. Then from here, we'll do the exact same thing for our red group. We won't need to do it for our logo though, because I'm always going to want that to be displayed, regardless if a user is viewing this on a desktop or a mobile device. So I'm going to select on my red group here, and now I'm just going to define a condition on this group that will just recognize when the current page width is less than 690 pixels. What I'm going to do is select that this element should be visible, and unlike our existing two groups, I'm actually going to unselect that this should be true. And the reason for that is because if we were to jump over to our layout tab, by default, this group is always going to be visible, regardless if the user is logged in or logged out. And so if it's always visible in my condition, I'm just going to need to create a way to make it invisible. What I'll also need to do is jump over to my layout tab and tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that just means that when it's no longer visible, it will not take up any space within my navigation menu. And then finally, the very last thing we'll need to do is just create a condition on our hamburger icon. So under my elements tree, I'm going to select on my hamburger icon. I will click on this. And if you remember, by default, this element was not visible on our page load. So we're going to create a condition, and we'll need to recognize when it should in fact be displayed. We're going to define a condition here, and we're going to recognize when the current page width is once again less than 690 pixels. And in this case, I will select that this element should be visible, and I will tick that that should be true. Now, when it comes to those two groups here, you'll see that these will hide and display because they don't have any additional conditions that recognize when the user's logged in or out. You can really start to get a good idea of how this is going to function. And look, to be honest, that's everything we'll need to include within our navigation menu. I know it took a long time just to get to this point, but from here, it's time to jump back to our homepage so we can actually add this navigation menu onto it. So if we head up to our page drop-down menu, we're going to open up our index page. Then on this page, if we were to scroll right down to the bottom of our elements tree, I'm just going to move my head out of the way here. You'll see this menu which references all of your reusable elements. And at this point in time, we have our header menu that we've just created. So I'm going to add this onto my page here. And then if I select on my layout tab, I'm going to make this the very first element at the top of my page. And what I love about this reusable element is that because we've already taken the time to build it, we can now just add it onto any page we would like, and all of the formatting, the workflows, the responsive settings, they're all going to copy across. So you don't need to rebuild those from scratch again. One thing I should just point out though is that if you ever want to make changes to your menu, you won't be able to do this directly on your page. Instead, you'll just have to jump back into the header menu itself, and you'll need to make changes here. But of course, they'll be reflected in real time onto your homepage. Now, if I was to quickly just jump back to my homepage and run a preview of my application here, what you'll see is that in my navigation menu, by default, because I'm not logged into an account, I have the menu option here to either sign in or sign up. And if I was to reduce the size of my browser here, you'll see we now have a fully responsive experience once our page is below 690 pixels. And of course, if we ever wanted to navigate between all of the pages in our app, so let's say we wanted to buy properties, we could click on this text element, it would run our workflow, and it'll send us through to our search results page, which at this point in time, our page is blank. But another thing I should point out is that you'll notice here we have our URL parameters that have been sent through with it. So we have our listing type parameter, which just says that we're interested in properties that are for sale. And for our location, it's just pulled through our city. Jumping back to our Notion checklist, I'm just going to tick off that we've finished building out the features to create a navigation menu, which of course within that we built out the workflows and we went above and beyond and made that fully responsive. Moving down through our list of features within my Notion checklist today, the next thing I wanted to do was actually skip ahead and instead just focus on this feature where we can create a property listing. Now, this is going to be one of the first real core features that powers our platform today. Because when you think about it, if users can't create property listings, then we actually can't display those listings. And so this feature is going to power a large portion of our app today. Now, I hope you're ready because this one is going to be a long section of our tutorial. And I'm going to be sure to explain everything I can in as much detail as possible, so that way you can clearly understand all of these steps and follow along with me. And so the first thing we're going to do is jump back into our bubble editor. Now, at this point in time, if we were to open up our page drop-down menu, we've created this page known as the listing. Now, the reason we've created this is because within our navigation menu, when we'd originally built out the navigation workflows, we created a way for users to be able to list properties on our Zillow clone. And so that's why this page has already been created. But of course, at this point in time, it is blank. There's nothing on it and we haven't made any changes to it. So what we'll need to do first of all is double click on the page, open up our property editor and give this page a container layout. So we're going to head to our layout tab here and we're going to update the container layout to be a column because we'll be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. So that means all of the elements will be positioned vertically. Then once we've updated the container layout, I'd like to add my reusable navigation menu to the top of my page. And so in order to do that, I'm going to move my head out of the way here. I'm going to scroll right to the bottom of my elements tree and I'm going to grab my header menu under my reusable elements. I'll add that onto the page and that is all I need to do. Honestly, every time I add that reusable element onto my page, it brings a tear of joy to my eyes because it saves so much time having to rebuild that. But from here, what I want to do is focus on building out the actual experience, which allows us to upload a new property listing to our property marketplace. And so when it comes to this experience, I'm going to actually break this down into two different sections. So when a real estate agent wants to actually list a property, I'm going to start by grabbing some basic details about that. And I'm going to display all of that information in a group. Now, when they select that they want to move on to the next step in the process of listing a property, what I'm going to do is then hide that first group and display a second group, which will allow them to add in all of the full details for each property listing. So things like all of the additional images, the description, the amenities, and the list just goes on. And by breaking this down into two different sections, it just helps enhance the end user experience. Because if someone had to add all of that information at once, they would kind of be overwhelmed with how much they need to add for their property listing. Whereas by breaking it down into more manageable steps, it's just going to create a nicer end user experience for them. So as I mentioned, the first thing I'd like to do is add a group element onto my page. So under my containers menu, I'm just going to grab a group. I'll add this onto my page here. And the first thing I'll do with this group is just update the name of this. I'm going to call this group step 1. Because this is going to be step 1 in the process of listing a property. I'm then going to jump over to my appearance tab quickly because I'd like to detach the style of this group just because I want to add a solid border around the group itself. And then I'd also like to update the roundness of this group's borders to be 5. So now when I click away, I can easily see where this group sits on my page. I'll then select on my group again and head over to my layout tab. And the first thing I'll need to do here is give my group a container layout, because we'll need to determine in which order elements are going to be placed inside of this container. And for the container layout, this is going to be a column because I'll be stacking elements from top to bottom. Now we can make this group fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to, like always, set the minimum width as 0 while leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this group's going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. I will come back and update the height and the margin settings in a moment. But before we do that, we need to focus on adding all of the elements we want to display inside of this group. And the very first element I want to add is going to be a large heading. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element and add that inside of my group. And for this text element, I'm going to have this display the words, "Let's add your property." Now for this font, because this is going to be our main heading, I'm going to scroll on down and choose to detach the default style. I'm going to update the font size to be 30, and I'm also going to choose to bold this. I'll then need to make this element fully responsive. So if I jump to my layout tab, I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now, of course, this is going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of my group. For the height, I'll also set this to be 0, and that's going to collapse nicely around all of the text inside of it. And then finally, for the margins around this text element, I'm going to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right here. So that way, this just ensures that this text element doesn't touch the borders of my actual group. Now, below this text element, I'm going to add yet another. And following that is going to be a series of input fields, which will allow the user to start adding the information for the property they want to list. And so instead of having to rebuild a heading from scratch, I'm just going to make a copy of my existing heading here. I'll head over to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to update this text to display the words listing type. So below this is going to be an input field where a user can determine what type of listing this is. So are they looking to sell a property or are they looking to rent a property? Now for this heading, I don't need it to be this large. So what I'm going to do is just update the font size here to be 14, but I am happy to keep this bold. And I'd also just like to remove some of that top margin there. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab and just update the top margin here to be 20. And because we made a copy of our existing heading element, we don't need to update any of the responsive settings. Those were all duplicated across when we copied our element. Now below our second heading here, I'd like to add an input field, which as I mentioned, will allow a user to determine what type of property listing this is going to be. And so if I scroll on down to my input forms, what I'm going to do is actually use a drop-down input field. And look, I'm sure you're probably familiar with drop-downs, even if you haven't used them in Bubble before. Drop-downs are everywhere across websites and mobile apps. And as the name would suggest, when a user clicks on this, it's going to drop down with a series of options that they can choose from. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this input field. I'm going to call this drop-down listing type. So that way, when we build out our workflow later on, we know exactly which input field to reference when we're storing the listing type for a new property. Now, when you're using drop-down menus in Bubble, you have the ability to add in a series of manual choices, or you can reference a list of dynamic choices. And in our case today, we are going to use the list of dynamic choices because if you remember, when we first set up our database, we created a series of option sets, and one of those was known as the listing type. So if we just quickly open up our data tab here and head to our option sets menu, you'll see straight away we have this listing type option set. And within that, we have two options. There's the option for this property to be for sale or this option for it to be a rental. And so within our drop-down menu, I just like to reference these two options here. And this is where you'll start to see the power of option sets come to life. Because I've already taken the time to create these, users can only select from these two options. They can't add in a third option or even add a typo into something they type. It just truly gives me, as the admin of my application, full control over the options that they can select. So if we jump back to our design tab, under our choices style here, we're going to select to display a list of dynamic choices. Then from here, we'll just need to define which type of choices we'd like the users to select from. And in this case, it's going to be our listing type, which is our option set. For the choices source, so this is going to determine of our option set, which options are going to be displayed. This is going to be super straightforward. I want it to be all of the listing types. And in that case, there's only two. There's our sale and there's our rental. Then for the caption, this is the text that's actually displayed within our drop-down menu. This is just going to be the display text of each option. So the display text is the actual name or the title that's referenced in that option set list. And look, that's all we'll need to create for now. What we will need to do though is just jump over to our layout tab, because what I'd like to do is make this element fully responsive. So at this point in time, this drop-down menu is fixed at a value of 250 pixels. Now, while I'm quite happy with the width of this element, I actually don't want this to be fixed. What I'd like to do is instead unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I'm going to still set the maximum width to be 250 pixels, but I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, which just means that if the screen was to collapse in size, or shrink, I should say, this element will be fully responsive and continue to shrink with it. But that being said, with the maximum width of 200, it will be no larger than the current size you see here. When it comes to the height, I am happy to keep this at a fixed value of 48 pixels, because I think that's the perfect height for this drop-down menu. And look, we don't need this to expand downwards. It just needs to take up this much space. Now, finally, I'd also like to add in some margin around this element. I'm going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right there. Now below this, what I'd like to do is add in yet another input field, and that input field is going to determine the address for this property listing. But before I add in that input field, I'd just like to copy across my existing heading here. I'll jump to my appearance tab, and this is just going to display the words street address. So that way the user knows that below this is where they're going to add in the address for the property. Now, when it comes to the input field we're going to use, we'll head to our input forms, and I'm actually going to use a search box here because similar to our homepage, I'd actually like to update the choices style to reference a list of geographical places, which means that this search box is now going to connect with Google Maps. So that way users can search and select from real world addresses. While I'm here, I'd also like to update the name of this. I'm going to call this search box address. And then finally, we'll need to make this element fully responsive. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, but I'll leave the maximum width here as 500 pixels. Now 500 is purely just a personal preference. There's nothing scientific about it. I just think that 500 pixels is enough to display a full address. If you wanted to make this longer or shorter though, feel free to do that. For the height, similar to our drop-down menu, I'm going to leave this fixed at 48 pixels. So we don't need to change anything there. But I'd also like to add in the same margins we did before. So 5 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And then finally, within our first group here, I'd like to add in one additional input field, and that's just going to allow our user to select what type of property this is. So is it a townhouse? Is it an apartment? And of course, that's going to link to an existing option set list we've already created. But before we do that, I'm just going to make a copy of our heading element. I'm then going to jump to our appearance tab, and I'm going to update the text here to display the words property type. I'm then going to need to add in yet another drop-down menu, but in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to select on our very first drop-down menu and make a copy of that. Now for the copied version, I'm just going to start by updating the name of this. I'm going to call this drop-down property type. And what we'll also need to do is just update the option set list that we're referencing. So if I was to just jump over to my data tab, under our option sets menu, you may remember that we had this list known as the property type. And within this list, we had 3 options. A property could be a house, an apartment, or a townhouse. Now, by all means, if you wanted to add any additional property types, you could do that. But I'm just going to keep my list nice and simple at 3 options. So what we're going to then do is jump into our design tab and just update the choices here to reference our property type option set list. I'm then going to update all of the choices source because I'd like to reference all of those options in that list. And the caption will once again just be the current options display. Now, because we duplicated this drop-down menu across, we don't need to update any additional layout settings. Those were all copied across when we made a copy of the element. Now, this is all of the input fields I'd like to add into my very first group. So below our drop-down menu, I'm just going to add a button element, and that'll be the very last thing we add into this group here. So if I scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to grab a button. I'll add this into the group, and then if I just head to my layout tab, I can move that to the next position. So that way it is the last element inside of this group. Now, when it comes to this button, I'm just going to update the name of this. I'm going to call this button next step 1 because this is the button within our step 1 group. I'll also jump over to our appearance tab and update the text within this to display the word next. And then finally, I'd just like to update the size and the margins for this button. So if we open up our layout tab once again, we can update the width of this button to be 120 pixels. And look, I am happy to keep this as a fixed width. And the reason for that is because we'll never need to worry about our page being so narrow that it touches the borders of our button. So I'm quite happy to leave this as a fixed value. What I would like to do though is just update the minimum height to be 40. So that way the button is slightly more narrow. And then finally, we'll add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this button here. And now because that is the last element I'd like to add into our first group, I'm going to select on the group itself. So this is our group step 1. And they're going to update the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of the element to the content inside of it, it's just going to ensure that it will collapse nicely around all of our elements. Then from here, I'd just like to add in some margin around this group. I'm going to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and also 20 on the right. And that concludes everything we'll need to add into our very first step of the process of listing a property. Now what I'd like to do is build out a second group, which is going to contain a lot more input fields. This is where a user is going to store most of the information about a property. And in order to streamline that process, what we're going to do is actually make a copy of our existing group. But before we do that, I'd just like to expand the height of my page down, because right now we're almost running out of space. So if I just click on my overall page and open up the layout tab, I'm just going to set the minimum height to be 2000 for the time being. Now you can always come back and update this later on, but this is just going to give me plenty of space to work with here. Then from here, I'm going to select back onto my group step 1. I'm going to make a copy of this and I'm going to paste this onto my page. And that's just going to save me a whole lot of time having to update the layout and the design settings for our second group. But the first thing I will need to do is just update the name of this group. I'm going to call this group step 2, because this is step 2 in the process of listing a property. Now from here, we can start to update all of the elements that sit inside of this second group. And the very first thing I'm going to change is the main heading here. So if I select on this and open up my appearance tab, I'm just going to update this text to display the words "tell us more," because this is where we're going to prompt someone to add in all of the additional details for this property. Then below this, I'm going to add in a series of input fields. And before I do that, what I'm going to do is actually select on our drop-down menu, as well as our search box, and finally the second drop-down menu. And I'm just going to choose to delete these. But you'll notice that I did keep one of the headings here. And the reason for that is because I'd still like to reuse this heading. Only in this instance, I'd like this to display the words bedroom count. And then as you probably guessed, below this, I'm going to add in an input field, which allows someone to add how many bedrooms this property will have. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm going to add a standard input field below this text heading. And the very first thing I will do is just update the title of this. I'm going to call this input bedroom count. Now, because the bedroom count is stored as a number in our database. So if I quickly just jump over to our data tab and open up our data types, under our property data type, you'll see we've got things like a bathroom count and a bedroom count. And these are listed as numbers. Whereas over in our design tab, by default, an input field is listed as text. So I'm going to need to format this as a number, which if I open up this drop-down menu, I'm going to select from the integer. And so an integer is just another way of saying that we're storing a number in this field. So users will only be allowed to type in numbers in this field. They won't be able to type text, which is the exact experience we want. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to make this input field fully responsive. And when it comes to that process, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but I'm going to leave the maximum width as 200 pixels. And the reason for that is because I think that 200 pixels is more than enough to display a couple of numbers. So I don't want this to be very long. When it comes to the height though, I'm quite happy to leave that fixed at 48 pixels. But for the margins, I'm just going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and then 20 on the right. Now below this, I'd actually like to make a copy of both these elements because I'd now like the user to add in the bathroom count. So I'm going to select on both my heading and my input field. I'll make a copy of that. I'll select in my group and paste those in. I can then just move these above my button element there. And I'll select on my heading, head to my appearance tab, and just update this to display the words bathroom count. I can then select on my input field, and I'm going to update the title of this. I'm going to call this input bathroom count. And once again, because we're going to be storing a number in this, we're going to need to have the content format as an integer, but thankfully all of that copied across when we made a duplicate of the input field itself. So we don't need to make any additional changes right now. Below this though, I'd like to make another copy of this input field because I'd like someone to add in the year that this property was built. So I'm going to once again select on my input field as well as my heading. I'm going to move these above my button. I'll select on the text element and I'll have this display the words year built. I'll then select on my input field. I'll update the name of this to be called input year built. And I'm actually going to keep this as an integer because in our database, once again, under our property data type, the year built is set as a number. And to be honest, most of the input fields we're going to add today are going to be set as numbers. So I can see there's things like the square footage, the sell price, as well as things like the monthly rental price, and all of these are listed as numbers. So that's why we need to set our input fields as integers. If we just jump back into our design tab, I'm going to make yet another copy of our heading and our input field. So I'm going to select on both of those elements, make a copy of them, and move them above my button here. And the very first thing I'll change with these new elements is just the heading. I'm going to have this display the words property size, and then in brackets, just square feet. So that way a user knows that this is where they need to add the square footage of a property. Then I will select on the input field below this, and I'll update the title to be called input size square feet. And then below this input field, I'd like to add in one that's just going to determine the sell price for this property. And now this is where things are going to change up slightly. If we were to just take a moment and scroll back up to our very first group here, you may remember that in the first drop-down field, a user was selecting the listing type for this property. So it could either be a property for sale or a property for rent. Now, if I was to add an input field within my second group, which determines the sell price of the property, that might not be relevant to someone who just wants to rent a property. And so what I'm going to need to do is create a way to make sure I only display the relevant price input field based on the listing type for this property. And so essentially, if a user is wanting to sell a property, I'm going to add an input field which allows them to add the total price they want to sell it for. But if a user is wanting to just rent a property, I'm going to have a separate field which is just going to allow them to add the monthly rental price for that property. And I'll only want to display one of those at any given point in time. And so because I'd like to add a heading and an input field for each one of those two options, and of course one of those options will be hidden, I'm going to actually add those into a group. So that way I can just choose to hide all of the elements in the group with one condition, as opposed to having to replicate the same condition across two different elements. And so what I'm going to do is head to my containers menu here, and I'm going to add a group element below my input field. And I'm going to update the name of this group to be called group sell price. Because within this group, we're going to add an input field which allows someone to determine what price they would like to sell the property for. Now, when we're working with this group, the first thing I'm going to do is detach the style of this, just so I can give this a flat background color. And if I set this to be something like a light shade of red, it'll just allow me to see where it actually sits in my overall white group. Now, by all means, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can just remove this here. But for the time being, this is going to be a great visual cue. I'll then need to make this element fully responsive. So if I jump to my layout tab here, the first thing I'll have to do is set a container layout for this group. Now, similar to our existing input fields, I'm going to have a heading at the top, and then below that, I'm going to have an input field, which means I'm going to be stacking elements vertically. So that means the column option is going to be the most appropriate for this group. I'm then going to head on down to our width settings, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and then I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. It doesn't really matter, because again, when you go to preview your app, you'll update the background color of this group to be white once again. So you're actually not going to be able to see this group on your page. It'll just blend in with the background. Now, I will come back and update the height and the margins in a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to just add my two elements inside of this group. So I'm going to select on my heading here, as well as my input field. I'll make a copy of those. I'll then click into my red group and paste in a version of them. Then when it comes to these two elements, I'm going to select on my text element first. I'll jump to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to update the text within this to display the words sell price. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab, because what I'd like to do is remove all of the margin around this text element. And the reason for that is because I'm going to add the same margin onto my overall group. So under my layout tab here, I'm just going to set all of my margins back to 0. And then we'll need to make changes to the input field that sits below this. So the first thing I'll do is update the title of this input field. So I'm going to call this input sell price. Now, if we jump over into our appearance tab here, I'd actually like to update the content format of this input field. So at the moment, this is storing just an integer, which is a number. Whereas although I would like to actually still store this as a number, I'd just like to format this as a currency, because that will allow me to add a currency prefix into this. And so that's just going to look like a dollar value, but in our database, it will still store as a number. I'm then going to jump over to our layout tab once again, And I'm just going to update the maximum width for this input field to be 400 pixels. Just because, hey, if we're selling properties for a couple mil, we're going to need some space to add in all those zeros. And so I just think 400 pixels is going to be the perfect size there. I'll still leave the height fixed at 48 pixels, but I'd also just like to remove the margins on the side of this input field. But I do just want to note that I'm going to keep the top margin there, just to space this input field away from our heading. So for the left margin, I'll set that to 0, and I'll do the exact same thing for my right margin. And that's all of the elements I'd like to add into this group. So I'm going to select on the overall group, head to my layout tab, and just update the minimum height here to be 0. And that's now going to collapse it around all of the elements inside of it. Now I'd like to add in the same margins around this group that we had on our text element. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And now you'll see it will fit nicely with all of our existing input fields. But as I mentioned when I first talked about adding this group onto my page, I don't want this group to always be visible. I only want this group to be shown when someone selects that the listing type for this property is a property that's going to be for sale, not for rent. And so what we're going to do on our red group here is just head to our layout tab, and we're actually going to unselect that this group should be visible when the page is loaded. I'm also going to select to collapse this group when it's hidden. So that way when it's not shown, it doesn't take up any empty space within our second white group here. But what we'll need to do now is create a condition that just recognizes when this group should be displayed. And that condition should fire whenever someone selects the option from our drop-down menu that they want to sell a property. So if I just select on our conditional tab for our red group, I'm going to create a condition, and I'm just going to recognize when the drop-down menu with the listing type. So if I just type in the word drop, I can reference the drop-down listing type. When its value is in fact a property that's going to be for sale. What I'd like to do is select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And so that is how we can now display this input field in the relevant scenario. However, of course, what happens if someone wants to list a property as a rental, not a property for sale? What we're going to do is create another duplicate version of this red group, and we're going to have a price which determines the monthly rental cost for that property. And we'll only display that second red group when someone selects that they want the property to be a rental, not a property for sale. So in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to make a copy of my red group here. I'll move this above my button element. And the first thing I'll do is just head over to the title of this group, and I'm going to call this group rental price. I'll then select on the heading inside of this group. And if I jump to my appearance tab, I'm just going to update the text to display the words monthly rental price. Then from here, I'll select on my input field below this, and I'm just going to update the name of this to be called rental price. And once again, this is going to be a currency, so we won't need to change the formatting here. The only thing we will need to do is select on our red group once again, and just update the condition that's going to determine when this group should be visible. And in this case, I'd only like this group to be shown when the drop-down listing type, when its value is in fact a rental. And so that is how we can now create an experience where only one of these groups is displayed based on the relevant option that was selected. Now from here, we can continue adding in all of the additional input fields I'd like to add into our second group here. And the next thing I'd like to do is enable someone to upload a featured image for this property. So the featured image is going to be the thumbnail image that's displayed in our repeating group of properties on things like our homepage or our search results page. And so in order to add this in, the first thing I'm going to do is just copy a heading element. I'll drag this above my button, and I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab, and I'll have this display the words featured image. Now for this image, I'm going to scroll on down, and I'm going to add in a picture uploader element, which I can just see my head is in the way. So I'm going to grab a picture uploader here, and I'll add that below my text heading. I'll then just pop my head back over there. Now, before I make any changes to this picture uploader, I just like to update the title of this. So I'm going to call this picture uploader featured image. Then once I've changed that, I'd like to also update the dimensions of this element. So if we head to our layout tab, I'm going to unselect that this element should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to 0, but I don't want to leave the maximum width as infinite because right now it's quite long. It takes up the full width of our page. So I'm going to set the maximum width to be 400 pixels. So this is going to be the same width that we just used for the input fields above it. Now for the height, I'm actually going to update this to be 200 pixels. And look, I am going to keep that as a fixed width because I'm quite happy with the image that's displayed in here to always be this height. It just means that when the page collapses in width, the image will just continually expand and crop to fill in the required space that it has. And perhaps when I run a preview of my application, you'll see that in action. But for the time being, while I'm in my layout tab, I'd also like to update the top margins here to be 5, the left margin to be 20, and the right margin to also be 20. Now, when it comes to a property listing today, users will be able to upload a featured image for that property. But what I'd also like to do is enable them to upload a series of additional images. And so that way, when someone clicks on a property to view the full details of it, I'm going to display all of those additional images. And so when it comes to uploading multiple images in Bubble, we're going to run into a small dilemma here. And that dilemma is around our picture uploader element. So with the standard picture uploader element, you're only able to upload one image at a time. Whereas as I just mentioned, we need to be able to upload multiple images. But thankfully, the solution to this is that we're going to install a free plugin built by Bubble, which will enable us to do this. So if we jump over to our plugins tab here, we're going to add a new plugin and we're going to type in the word multi. And the plugin I'd like to install is this multi-file uploader, which is a free plugin, as I mentioned, built by Bubble. Once we've installed that, we can close our plugin library, jump back into our design tab, and under our input forms, what you'll now see is the ability to add in a multi-file uploader. And so I'm just going to add one of these below our picture uploader, but on top of this file uploader, I should actually add in another heading. So I'm just going to make a copy of my existing heading here, and I'll move this above my multi-file uploader, and I'll just update this heading to display the words additional images. Then from here, I'm going to select on my multi-file uploader, and the first thing I'll do is just update the title of this. I'm going to call this multi-file uploader additional images. Now, while we're working on this element, I'm also going to scroll on down and just update the border around this to be a solid color. So that way, when I click away, I can actually just see where this sits on my page for the time being. I'll then select back on my multi-file uploader, jump over to my layout tab, because I'd now like to update the dimensions of this. Now, when it comes to the size of this element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Similar to our existing picture uploader element, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and I'm going to also set the maximum width to be 400 pixels. Now, when it comes to the height, I am going to do something slightly different. And before I do that, I should actually just explain how this multi-file uploader will work. So when it comes to a standard picture uploader, when someone selects an image that they want to upload, a preview of that image will be displayed inside of this element. Whereas with a multi-file uploader, let's say if you were to upload 4 images at once, it's actually not going to display a preview of those images. Instead, it's going to display the title of the files for those images. And so if a user uploads something like 10 photos, it's going to display 10 different file names. And so for the height on this element here, I'd like this to continually expand down and display as many file names as it needs to. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now I'm going to set the minimum height here to be 150 pixels. And there's no particular reason why I selected 150. It's mainly just because I think this is enough space to display a few different file names. But if I leave the maximum height as infinite, if someone was to upload a long series of files, this element would continually expand down and display all of the file names. And so that's why I'm going to leave this value as infinite. I'm also then just going to add a top margin here of 5, a left margin of 20, and a right margin of 20. Now, as I just mentioned, this multi-file uploader will only display the file name of an image that's uploaded. Whereas what I'd still like to do is create an experience where we can display a preview of all of those images. And so we're actually gonna have to manually build that out ourselves. And we're gonna do that by adding a repeating group on our page, which is going to display a preview of all of the images uploaded into this element. Now, this repeating group by default should not be displayed on our page. It should be hidden. The only time I'd like it to be shown is when there is a value in this file uploader. So when someone has uploaded at least one image. And so similar to our previous input fields that were hidden on our page, I'm going to add a group element onto my page. And then within that group, I'll add a repeating group, which will display a list of all of those images. So under our containers menu, I'm going to grab a group element and add this below my multi-file uploader. Now for this group, I'm going to update the name of this to be called group image preview. And I can see I just have a small typo there I'm going to fix. Now similar to before, when it comes to this group, I'm also going to update the color of this. So if I jump to my appearance tab and detach the style, I'm going to add a flat background color and I'll set that to be a light shade of red. Then from here, I can jump over to my layout tab and make this group fully responsive. Now, when it comes to the container layout for this group, I'm actually going to only ever have one element inside this group, and that will be our repeating group. So it doesn't really matter if you select from the row or the column option, because we're not really stacking elements, but I'm just a column guy myself, so I'm going to select the column option. I'll then unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. We'll leave the maximum width as infinite. And now we will come back and update the height of this group in a moment. But while I'm here, I would in fact like to add the margins around this group, just so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my page or the element that sits above it. So I'm going to add a top margin of 10 pixels, a left margin of 20, and a right margin of 20. And you'll see why I've done this here in a moment. Long story short, it's just going to help us when it comes to the process of making our repeating group fully responsive. Because at this point in time, we already know that we have 20 pixels of margin on each side of this group. But I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. From here, as I mentioned, we're going to add a repeating group into our red group. And when it comes to this repeating group, the first thing we'll need to do is jump over to our appearance tab. And we're going to need to give this repeating group a data source. So that way it knows what list of items to display. Now for the type of content, we're going to scroll all the way down and we're just going to select that we want to display a list of images. And for the data source, so this is where we'll determine what list of images we want to show. I'd like it to equal the value of all of the images uploaded into our multi-file uploader. So for the data source, I'm going to type in the word multi and I'm going to reference the multi-file uploader, its value. Then when it comes to the number of rows and columns here, I'm going to unselect both of these options because at this point in time, it was only displaying 4 entries, which is all good and well if you only ever wanted to display 4 images. But what happens if someone uploads 5 images, 6 images, or even 10 images? I want to make sure I can display them all. Now, while we're working in this group, I'm also just going to update the minimum height of each row and the minimum width of each column to be 300 by 300. Now, there's nothing scientific about why I've selected these values. I just think that this is going to be enough space to start working within when I add my image into our repeating group cell. But as I've mentioned in the past, when it comes to finding the perfect settings for a repeating group, it's definitely just a matter of trial and error. So you'll see firsthand today how it takes me a little bit of time to figure out the perfect settings. And of course, I'll explain to you my thought process along the way. But after updating these settings here, I'm going to jump over to my layout tab and just make this repeating group fully responsive inside of our red group. And so the first thing I'll do is just head to my container layout. I'm going to set this to be a column. Now, once again, it doesn't really matter if you select between a column or a row. Inside of this repeating group, we're only going to display one image. So it's not like we're stacking elements on top of each other. I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And we'll come back and update the height and the margins in a moment. For now though, what I'd like to do is add my image element into this repeating group. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'll select to grab an image. I'll place that in my repeating group. And now what I'll need to do is give this a dynamic image data source. So that way this knows which image to display. And of course, it's going to be the image stored within my repeating group cell. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data and I'm going to reference the current cell's image. It's truly as simple as that. One additional thing I would like to do when I'm working with dynamic images is just to select this more option so I can process this image with ImgX and just tick this option to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping it, which just means that the image will span out and take up the full space that I give it here. I'm then going to choose to close that. Now, while I'm working on this image, I'm just going to detach the style of this and I'm going to give it a solid border, just so that way when I click away, I can see where that image sits inside of my repeating group. I'm then going to click on my image, head over to my layout tab, and I'm going to want to make this image fully responsive. So in order to do that, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this image is going to take up as little or as much space as it can within my repeating group cell. But what I'd also like to do is tick this option to keep this image's aspect ratio fixed. And if I set this at a 2:1 ratio, you'll now see that it's going to be a perfect rectangle at any given point in time. So regardless of how large or small this image becomes, it will always take this shape. Then finally, in our layout tab, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border of this image. So that way it doesn't touch the edge of my repeating group cell. And that is all of the elements I'll need to add into my repeating group. So I'm going to click on the repeating group itself, head to my layout tab, and I'm now going to update the minimum height to be 0, which means that it's now going to collapse around all of the elements inside of it. I'll then jump over into my appearance tab, and I can now set the minimum height of each row to be 0. And once again, that will just truly ensure that it collapses around the height of the image. But when it comes to the minimum width here, this is where things can get a little bit complex. And so how can we find out the perfect width for this repeating group cell that allows it to be fully responsive across both a desktop and a mobile device? If I was to quickly just jump over into my responsive tab here and just show you what this looks like on a desktop, this repeating group's just going to continually expand out and display more images based on how much size we have to show. However, when I start reducing the width of this, as you'll see, it's fully responsive. But at 320 pixels, you'll see that my image is getting cut off here. And the reason for that is because we're currently viewing our page at 320 pixels, which again is the smallest possible device someone could ever use your application on. And at this point in time, the minimum width of our repeating group column is 300 pixels, which although it is less than 320 pixels, you need to remember that on our repeating group, which sits inside of our red group here, we have 20 pixels of margin on each side. So we've got 300 pixels plus 20 pixels plus 20 pixels. So that's 340 pixels. So it's already too big. But the other thing we need to factor in is that our red group actually sits inside another group, which also has 20 pixels of margin on each side. So from 340, we need to add another 20 plus another 20. So that's 380 pixels in total. And so in order to find the perfect dimensions for our repeating group column width, what we could actually do is work backwards. So let's say we've got 320 pixels in total. We're going to start by taking off the 20 pixels of margin on each side of our white group here. So 320, take 20, take 20 is 280. Then inside that, our red group has another 20 pixels of margin on each side. So 280 minus 20 minus 20 is going to be 240. And so the perfect size for our repeating group width is in fact going to be 240 pixels. And as you'll now see, that is going to make this fully responsive on the smallest possible mobile device. Whereas as we continue to expand our page out, these images will just continually add additional slots within our repeating group. But this is truly what I mean about repeating groups being experimental. I can't recall a time where I ever got the dimensions perfect the first time around. Sometimes it is just a matter of trying to do some basic math in order to find the perfect dimensions. Once we've finished configuring our repeating group though, I'm just gonna jump back over into my UI builder. I will select on our overall red group, and I can now jump over to my layout tab and update its minimum height to be 0. And that will just ensure that it collapses around the repeating group inside of it. But we're not done just yet. If you remember from before, I'd mentioned that this group should only be displayed whenever there actually is an image to show a preview of within our multi-file uploader. And so it's at this point that we're going to create that feature. So if I was to head to my layout tab for our group image preview, this is our red group. What I'm gonna do is unselect that this should be visible on page load. And I'm also gonna select to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space in our white group. I'm then gonna jump over to our conditional tab, and I'm gonna define a new condition here. And within this condition, I'm just gonna recognize when the multi-file uploader, when its value, when the count of how many files have been added into this is greater than 0, meaning someone has uploaded at least one image. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And that is all we'll need to add for this condition. While we're just building out our application, I'm just going to display this red group just so I can get an idea of all of the elements that are going to sit within my page here. At this point though, we're almost on the home stretch. There's just a few additional input fields I'd like to add into our second group. And so what I'm gonna do is grab this heading here, make a copy of that, move it above my button element, and I'm going to open up my appearance tab and have this text display the words property description. So this is where someone's going to be able to add the full description for this property listing. Now this description is going to be quite lengthy. It's going to include all the information about the property, potentially who the real estate agent is, and a whole lot more. So when it comes to the input field we're going to use, we're actually not going to use a standard input field. Instead, we're going to select the option below this, which is known as a multi-line input field. Now a multi-line input field, as the name would suggest, allows a user to add in multiple lines of text. In a standard input field, if someone was to write in a long string of text, it would continually just expand outwards. Whereas with a multi-line input field, if there's more than one line of text, it will continually expand downwards. So this is where you can start to display a long paragraph of text, which is perfect for things like property descriptions. Now, when it comes to this multi-line input, I'm just going to update the name of this first of all to be called multi-line input product description. Just so that way, when I build out my workflow in a moment, I know which element to reference. I'll then jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to make this element fully responsive. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width here to be 0. And then when it comes to the maximum width, I'm not going to leave this as infinite. Instead, I'm going to set this to be 800 pixels. And the reason for that is because I just think 800 pixels is enough to add everything I need. By all means, if you want this to be smaller or larger, you can set this maximum width to be whatever you want. For the height, I'm also going to update the minimum height to be 48 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 48 pixels is because that is the same height as any other input field on our page. But if I was to leave the maximum height as infinite, that will just ensure that this multi-line input field will continually just expand down as it's needed. So that way we can display a long paragraph of text. While I'm here, I'm also just going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that will just ensure that this element sits in line with all of our existing elements on the page. Below this, I'm going to add in yet another input field. I'm sure you're probably sick of me saying that by now, but I promise we're almost there. So in order to do that, I'm going to first of all copy this text heading, drag this above my button, and I'll update this text element to display the word property features. So I'm just going to get rid of that second word there, and I'll update this. Now, if you remember, in our database, we had created an option set which displayed a list of property features. So if I was to quickly just jump over into my data tab, open up my option sets, you'll see the option here known as property features. And inside this, I just gave 4 small examples. A property could have air conditioner, a furnace, a garage, or a pool. And if I was to open up my property data type under my data types here, what you'll see is that a property can have multiple features. So it's not just limited to having one feature. And so when it comes to the input field we're going to need to use, we're going to have to install yet another plugin. And the reason for that is because if I was to add something like a drop-down menu in and reference that option set list, from a standard drop-down menu, users are only able to select one option. Whereas in this case, I want my users to be able to select as many options that are relevant to the house as possible. And so if we jump over to our plugins tab, we're going to open up our plugin library once again. And similar to before, we're actually going to type in the word multi. Now, the very first plugin here is known as the multi-select dropdown. And as the name would suggest, this is a dropdown field where users can select multiple items. So they're not just limited to one. So I'm going to choose to install this here. I'll close my plugin library. I'll jump back into my design tab. And now under our input forms, you'll see the option to add a multi dropdown onto your page. We're going to do that here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, like always, update the name of this. I'm going to call this multi dropdown property features. Then, similar to our previous dropdown menus on our page, I'm going to update the choices style to be a list of dynamic choices. So that way users can only select from my predetermined list of option sets. For the type of choices, I'm going to reference the property features option set that I've just shown you. For the choices I want to show, I'm going to select all of the property features we've created. And then for the caption, I'm just going to reference the current option, it's display text, which is the actual name of the feature. And that's all we'll need to do for now. You'll see this element in action in a moment when I run a preview of my page. But what I'd like to do is just jump over into my layout tab so we can make this element fully responsive. And so when it comes to the width, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. And with the maximum width, I'm going to set this to be 400 pixels. So that way it sits in line with all of my additional input fields above it. For the minimum height, I could also set this to be 48 pixels because if you remember, that is the same amount of pixels as the height for all of my previous input fields. Now I am going to leave the maximum height as infinite. So when someone selects an option from our multi drop-down menu here, it almost adds like a little tag inside of it. And these tags can be a little bit bigger than text. So if it ever needs to display multiple tags, I'd like this menu to continually just expand down. So that way it fits all of them inside of it. Finally, I'm then going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And after this, we have just one last input field to add. I promise this is the very last one. And that input field is going to be a checkbox. And so I don't need to copy across a heading because a checkbox kind of looks like a heading. I'll show you in a second. But under our input forms, you'll see an option to add a checkbox here. Now for this input, I'm going to start by updating the name of this to be called checkbox is available. So this is just going to determine if a property is available on the market or not. And so for the label of this checkbox, I'm going to have this display property is available on the market. And I can see I just have a small typo there. And by default, I'm going to actually set this to be checked because when a listing is created, I'd like it to be checked that it is in fact available. Then later on, if someone sells a property, they can come back to this page and uncheck this, from which it will then remove that listing from being displayed anywhere in our marketplace. Now, when it comes to the design of this element, I'm just going to detach the default style and I'm just going to choose to bold this text. So that way it stands out as its own heading. I'll then jump to my layout tab and I'm going to make this element fully responsive across my page. So like always, I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. Now I am going to leave the maximum width as infinite because this looks like just a standard text element. And then for the minimum height, I'm also going to set that as 0 because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And as I promised, that is in fact the last input field we'll need to add onto our page. As you can see, this second group took a very long time to piece together, just because there's so many different types of input fields we had to leverage. But all we need to do now is build out the workflow that's going to run in order to publish a listing. And now that is exactly what I would be saying if that was all that was left. You didn't think it was going to be that easy, did you? One thing I need to point out is that at this point in time, if we were to scroll on up to the top of our page, at this point in time, both of our groups here are currently being displayed by default. Whereas as I mentioned at the start of this module, I only want to display one of these groups at a time. So how can I do that? The way in which we can achieve that feature is by using what's known as a custom state in Bubble. Now, if you're new to Bubble, I don't expect you to know anything about custom states. It's my job today to teach you. And the best way to describe a custom state is that they're like a data field that you can store inside your page without having to actually reference your database. Now, why would you ever want to do that? In Bubble, you might need to store some information without actually referencing something in your database or creating an entry in your database as well. And so a custom state allows you to do that. As I mentioned, it's just a temporary value that sits inside your page. And as soon as your page is refreshed or reloaded, that value completely disappears and it resets itself. And the reason why I mention custom states is because today what I'd like to do is create a custom state on my page which just determines which one of these two groups should be displayed at any point in time. So as soon as this page is loaded, I'd like to display my first group, and I want my second group to be hidden. Then when someone clicks on our next button, I'd like group 1 to be hidden and group 2 to be shown. And so what I'm going to do is actually double click on my overall page. So this is my listing. Now, if you were to select this little information icon here, it's going to open up a backdoor menu. I'm just going to move this across so you can see it clearer. But inside this menu, you'll see the option to create what's known as a custom state. Now, when I click this, it's going to look exactly like the process of where we created a data field in our database. And that's because we're essentially creating a data field on our page. And today I want to call this state display step 1. So step 1 is our very first group. And if I set the value of this state to be yes, no, so I either do want to display step 1 or I don't want to display it, I can choose to create this. Now I can also give this a default value, exactly like how I can with a data field. And so if I set the default value to be yes, Bubble knows as soon as my page is loaded, it should be displaying step 1. I'm then going to create another custom state, and it's going to be much the same. I'm going to call this display step 2. Now for this state type, it's once again going to be a yes or no value because I either do want to display step 2 or I don't want to. I'm going to choose to create this. And for the default value of this state, I'm actually going to set this to be no because by default, as soon as the page is loaded, I won't want to display this second group. And so now this is how you can store a data value in your page without it referencing your actual database. But what we'll need to do is now create a way to have our groups reflect the value stored in our page. So if I was to just close this element inspector, click on my very first group. So this is my group step 1. What I'm going to do is unselect that this group should be visible on page load. And I'm going to select this option to collapse this group when it's hidden. So that way when it's shown, it doesn't take up any empty space on my page. And then from here, what we can do is create a new condition. And I'm going to recognize when my overall listing page. So if I scroll right down to the bottom, you'll be able to select on your listing page. And right at the bottom of this menu, you'll be able to reference your 2 custom states. So when the display step 1 custom state is in fact yes, which if you remember, it is by default. What I'm going to do is select that this group should be visible and tick that that should be true. And that now means that this group is going to be shown as soon as the page is loaded. And so what we're going to do is select on our second group here, and I'm going to jump to my layout tab once again, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm going to also collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab and I'll define a condition, and I'm just going to recognize when our listing page. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, I'll select when the listing, when its display step 2 custom state is in fact yes, this group should be visible, and I will tick that that is true. And now if I wanted to display both my groups again, I could scroll on up to my elements tree and just visualize these. But another thing I need to cover is how we can actually turn on and off our custom states based on which group we want to show. So by default, the display step 1 state is set to yes, meaning this group will be visible. But when someone selects this next button, what I'd like to do is turn off our display step 1 custom state and then turn on our display step 2 custom state. And so in order to do that, I'm going to click on my next button here. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, and I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this button is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word state, and you'll see an option to set the state of an element. Now the element I'm going to reference is our listing page, and you'll now see the ability to select from one of our 2 custom states. And so when this next button is clicked, what I'd like to do is update the display step 1 custom state. I'm now going to set its value to be no, meaning we no longer want to display our first group. And then if I set another custom state, I'm going to say that the display step 2 custom state should now equal yes, which means that our second group would become visible. And just like that, that's how we can create almost like a custom menu feature where we can jump between the 2 different sections of this page. And when I run a preview of this, you'll be able to see that in real time. But it's finally at this point that we can build out the workflow that's going to run to actually create a new property listing in our database. So if we scroll all the way down to the bottom of our page, I'm going to select on the next button in my second group here. And I'm actually going to update the text within this to display the word publish. I'm also going to update the title of this. I'm going to call this button publish. So that way when I build out a workflow, I can easily tell this apart from the existing workflow when the very first button was clicked. So when this is clicked, I'm going to run a workflow, and inside of this workflow, I'm going to need to do a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to need to do is actually create a way to store all of the larger data fields in our separate property data type. And so if I was to just open up my data tab once again, you may remember that we had 2 property data types. There was our original property here. So this displays all of the top level information. So these are just small data points like numbers, or even just data linked to our option sets. Whereas we also had this separate data type known as our property satellite. So this was our satellite floating off in space that contains all of the larger information that we then want to beam down and connect to our original property. And inside of this, we were storing the information of things like the full description, as well as all of the images. So first of all, in our workflow, I'm going to create this satellite, and then I'm going to create a property, and I'm going to link this property to that satellite. So if I jump to my workflow tab, I'm going to first of all head to our data tab, and I'm going to choose to create a new thing. Now the type of thing I'd like to create is first of all going to be our property satellite. I can then choose to add all of our fields here, and I'll just need to link the relevant data field in our database with the input field on our page. So for the full details, if I type in the word multi, I'm going to reference the value within our multi-line input, the product description. Now, for some reason, I've called this product description. What I actually meant to say was property description. So if I jump back into my design tab, I'm just going to quickly update the title of this. I'm going to call this property description. Look, if I can be honest, a week ago, I recorded another tutorial where I was creating products, not properties. So forgive me if my brain is completely fried at this point, but I'm having a hard time telling between the two. So if I've ever mentioned the word product throughout this tutorial and I haven't noticed it, what I actually meant to say was property. And I'll be sure to try my best to say the word property going forward. But let's just jump back into our workflow editor here. What I want to do is just make sure I can link the full description to our multi-line input, its value. And now you'll see that that will configure nicely. For the images, so this is going to be a list of images. I'd like to set this list as the value stored within our multi-file uploader. So I'm going to reference the multi-file uploader, its value. And now that's all we'll need to do when it comes to the process of creating our satellite data type. So the next thing we'll need to do is add an additional step within our workflow. We'll head to our data tab once again and choose to create another new thing. The type of thing we'd like to create here though is going to be a property. And now I'm just going to add in all of the data fields. And once again, we'll just need to match these with all of the relevant fields on our page. So for the address, this is going to be the address stored within our search box. So if we head all the way down to our search box, we can reference its value. For the bathroom count, I'm just going to type this in. But I'm going to reference the input bathroom count, its value. For the bedroom count, we'll do the exact same thing. So if you just type in bed, we'll reference the input bedroom count, its value. And look, I apologize if I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, but it truly is just a matter of finding the relevant input field on your page and selecting from it. For the featured image, this is going to be my picture uploader featured image, its value. Now for the full details, this is where we're going to create that satellite connection between our very first data type here. So for the full details, I want to link this to the result of step 1 in our workflow, which now means it's going to create a connection with our property satellite. And later on, you'll see how we can actually reference that connection. But for the time being, I'm just going to power ahead and add in all of the additional data fields. For the is available status, this is going to be the value of our checkbox is available. It's checked. For our listing type, I'm just going to type in the word drop down and reference our drop down listing type. For the monthly rental price, if I just type in the word rent, I can reference the input rental price, its value. For the property features, now what I need to do here is also once again set a list, because if you remember, this is where we're using our multi drop down menu. So I'm going to choose to set a list. And that list will be within our multi drop down, the property features. For the property type, I know that this is once again in a drop down menu. So I'm just going to type in the word drop and I'll reference the drop down property type, its value. I'm going to keep scrolling down. For the total count of saves, we actually don't need to do anything for that right now. So I'm actually going to delete this. For the sell price, I'm just going to type in the word sell and reference the input sell price, its value. For the square footage of this property, I'm just going to type in the word size and reference our input size square feet. For the views, we don't actually need to change this as well. So I'm going to delete this. And for the year built, if I just type in the word year, I'm going to reference the input year built. Now look, I know that was a lot to take in, but if you've taken the time to add all of the right naming conventions to all of your input fields, it's truly going to streamline the whole process of updating all of the data fields here. But thankfully, that's all we'll need to do here. There is just one last thing I want to do in this workflow though, and that is once a property has been created, I'd like to redirect someone through to a separate page in our app where they can view a list of all of their property listings. So what I'm going to do is add an additional step in my workflow. I'm going to head to a navigation event and select the go to page action. And the destination page here will be our manage page, because this is where a property owner or a landlord or a real estate agent will be able to manage all of their property listings. And to be honest, at this point, I'm absolutely exhausted. There was honestly so much involved in this module, but thankfully that is everything we need to create. So let's jump over and take a preview of what this whole experience is now going to look like. Over in a preview of my application, the first thing you'll notice on my listing page is that my first group is only being displayed. My second group is currently not visible. And that's because, of course, by default, our custom state was going to show this first group. Now, what I'm going to do is start by selecting my listing type. I'm going to say this is a property for sale. For the address, I'm just going to type in an address here in San Francisco. For the property type, I could say that this is a house. And now when I select this next button, it's not only going to hide our first group, but it will now display our second group. And it's from here that I can start to add in all of the information for this property. So I'm going to say that this has 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. It was built in, let's say, 1860. Property square footage is 2,200 square feet. The sell price, let's say I want it to be $1.2 million here. And I mean, in this economy, look, that's probably even a steal. But one thing I should just point out is that you will notice here that because we're selling a property, we only have access to add in our sell price, not our monthly rental price. And that's because our conditions have triggered perfectly on our red groups. If I then upload a featured image here, that will display within my picture uploader. I'm then going to scroll on down and select into my multi-file uploader and upload a series of additional images. And what you'll see is that as those files upload, our repeating group will now become visible, and we can see a long list of all of the additional images we need to preview. And so that looks great. We can then go to our property description. What I'm going to do is just paste in some text here. This is just dummy text. And then for our property features, I'm just going to select that this property has air conditioner, it's got a garage, and it's got a pool. And as I mentioned, when we were originally adding in this multi drop-down menu, all of the options here are displayed as tags, and you can choose to remove and then re-add anything you would like. And finally, I'm going to list that this property is available on the market. I'm going to select to publish this. That workflow is going to run, and it's going to not only create a new entry in our database, but it's now going to redirect us through to our manage page, as you can see within the URL here. And now at this point in time, this page is blank. So that's why you can't see anything on it. But if you were to look into your database, you would now see that you would have a new entry stored there, which displays your first property. Super exciting. From here though, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist, because what I'd love to do is just tick off that we've finally finished building out all of the features involved in creating a new property listing. And look, don't say I didn't warn you at the start of this module. It was a big one. But thankfully, this is one of the core features of our application, so it's such a relief to finally get that out of the way. And at this point, that is all I have time to include within this video. As you can see, we've been building for literally hours, and there's still so many features that I need to cover in as much detail as I possibly can. If you are interested in watching the rest of this course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description, so that way you can get access to it from my website. Now look, while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of your time having to learn how to rebuild all of these features from scratch. And look, on top of that, it's just going to help you launch your app or startup as quickly as possible. Within that full course, there's still so many features that I want to cover. This includes everything like being able to register user accounts, allowing users to log into their existing accounts, creating a user settings page, building a dashboard where property managers can actually manage their listings, allowing property managers to edit the details of existing listings, displaying the full details of each property, creating a bookmarks feature, allowing users to actually contact property agents. And honestly, the list just goes on. I really wasn't lying when I said there's still a whole suite of features that we need to cover. If you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble tutorials I share though, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.